Good evening, members. It's 6:30, and welcome to members of the public. Just the usual admin to go through this evening. I'd just like to quickly ask mobile phones, including my own, to go on silent or off, please. The meeting is being webcast. I hope the meeting is being webcast. We will get confirmation of that in a second. Evacuation procedures. There's no scheduled fire alarm practices tonight. There are some new people in the room. Fire exits are to the back of the seating area and behind me, and report down and gather in the Memorial Park. I understand, despite the lack of the visual up here, that we are being webcast. Any apologies for absence? I note Councillor Mrs. Kubert is not present. Has anyone seen her? We'll see if she turns up. Any resignations or replacements? There shouldn't be any, because this is a continuation meeting from earlier on. Declarations of conflict of interest. I note, Councillor Harvey, is there any difference to what you said?
There isn't, but just for the record, because I have to say it, I have a personal interest in a number of sites. It is not a DPI, as far as the lawyers have advised me, but I do have a personal interest, and I want it on the record, and I refer anybody to my register of interests.
Thank you very much, Councillor. No urgent items. There's no minutes to confirm tonight. Member and public participation. The only public participation I've been notified of is Councillor Golding, and Mr. Duncan Stone is here. Is Mr. Stone here? Okay, he wanted to speak on the pre-submission local plan. I have no other members of the public. Standing invitation to the portfolio holder who is present. Thank you, Councillor. No referrals to the committees or the council, but there'll be a slight referral this evening from one of our own meetings. Issues referred to the cabinet, nothing. Right, we will kick off tonight, and what we'll be doing is addressing in this order. We're going to go back to the minutes of one of the policies on the green infrastructure, which will be addressed by Andrew Hunter, followed by the affordable housing policy, followed by the infrastructure delivery plan. And the rural exceptions as well. Are you including that in the first item? Yes. So the rural exceptions and the green infrastructure. There's one little line of writing. If I could defer now to Mr. Hunter to present that.
Sorry, the rural exceptions will come up under the affordable housing policy. This is just to check with members that on page 8 of the minutes from the 30th of May, under 7.5, parks, playing fields and open space, members will remember that was a referral from council, and in the discussions at committee it said that the committee agreed that the essence of the motion be picked up in the discussions on policy EM5, which will be considered by this committee on the 26th of June. We just wanted to check whether members were comfortable that they had discussed that point under EM5, and if they hadn't, whether there were any comments that we needed to capture. When that issue came to committee back in May, we added an additional line into policy EM5, which is on page 106. Halfway down the page we said the Borough Council will seek to protect and enhance existing public open space, so that we had a catch-all that covered all open spaces. That wasn't there before, and it's just whether members are comfortable that that picks up the point, or whether anyone had any further comments. Just to say, I recollect, and I'm checking the minutes of the H&E committee where the same point was raised. I understand the report and methodology are going back to that in September. Thank you.
Any comments from members? Councillor Harvey?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Andrew. I guess from the intent of the motion to try and list out a series of key areas such as the War Memorial Park, the Common and others the members may well identify as being self-obvious to protect is one aspect. If, and this is the big question really, this section, and I'm looking at it now in terms of from the Borough Council right the way through those bullet points, offers in principle protection to any open space or any area, that's, I guess, they're trying to just get clarification and assurance from yourself that that's your interpretation as an officer. Because here it talks about, well, enhance existing public open space. And then in the second sentence, it talks about proposals for the redevelopment of public and private green spaces. So we've got public in the first sentence, but private in the second. And whether or not that just needs to be, will protect both public and where it is able private open space in both. Whether we're able to, because with the policy it does affect both. Even if you are entitled to bring a private piece of open space forward for development, you should still meet our planning policy, shouldn't you? And then the ABC bit, are they sequential? I'm looking at the or, and my suggestion is that they're not. It's you can meet one of the three of them, and you don't have to meet all of the three of them. But again, I just look for your reassurance as to your thoughts behind what you were thinking of the policy, Andrew. Really.
Yeah, just in terms of, I think in terms of where we as an organisation can seek to protect and enhance is on the public. And if you wanted to add words along the lines you said, that may be possible, but we as an authority would have more control over public open space than we would have private. Because those three bullets all have or after them, it's one of those things. So you're trying to identify that if you are losing open space, it has to comply with at least one of those individual items.
I mean, to be honest with you, I'd quite like to see it to be sequential, because I think the robust assessment is needed, as we do with employment land, as we do with other policy areas. It is a robust assessment that's required, and I'd like to see that written into planning applications so that DC have got that evidence in front of them. You've then got the evidence to prove it one way or the other to their satisfaction. I think the replacement areas to be at least the equivalent in terms of quality, quantity and accessibility is good. And I do like the bit there that I know we talked about you being positive in terms of where the MPPF was dragging us, but actually in this instance I think the negative is really important, that there will be no negative impact and that is the appropriate test. And then the final one, the proposal for alternative recreational provision which meets evidence local need. Well, I know some of us in the town, and I know the four of us sat on this side of the table, five of us on this side of the table have examples where, in the sense of some of our areas, we have under provision. We don't have enough green open space to start with. So in that context, if there is an ability here to meet local need through this policy, the sequentially setting of that three little bullet points might be a better way forward.
Just on that final bullet, I think that's talking about where you're losing the space and you're gaining something from a local need perspective that might not be open space. It may be, let's say you needed housing, and this is a way of facilitating that. But I don't see why the robust assessment couldn't come in first in that list.
On that last bullet point, just to be clear, Andrew, the proposal is for alternative recreational provision, so it's very clear on what the alternative is. It must meet local need, and in a way that does that in terms of to outweigh the loss. So I think in that terms, as long as we're offering a guarantee that if you're taking X, you must replace it with Y, and that Y must be to equal so it doesn't outweigh the loss. Am I interpreting it that way? It's the same thing.
I'm just sorry, I'm on the hoof, so it was a bit more difficult to do this.
Mulling again.
I think it does that, yes. I think that's what it's trying to achieve, yeah.
Officers agree with your interpretation? Yes. Officers agree with your interpretation. Councillor Mrs James?
Just on that point, I'm not sure it is. I think it could read we're going to take away this piece of open space, but what we're going to offer you instead in Norden is 2 golf goal posts, because there's a recreational need for that. I'm not so sure. So I think this is what's been picked up before by John Shaw, who says it's about capacity. If a ward doesn't have the capacity, and so I'm not so sure that is saying that. But the other point that I wanted to raise is, and in relation to the spirit of the of what was asked of council, I think that we ought to in the borough council will seek to protect and enhance existing public open space. I think we ought to say parks, public parks and open space, because we talked about parks in the motion. So.
I would just say that was an all-encompassing term. Public open space would cover parks, is a generic term to capture everything in one place.
And the other point that I wanted to raise is in relation to the report that's coming forward to H&E on the 24th. Is that what you're saying, that this piece of work is going to come forward, or a report is going to come forward to?
My understanding, and I'm not on that, don't go to that committee, but my understanding is that H&E are receiving a report in September on that particular issue, which I think you referred to when we talked about it before.
If something comes forward from H&E, or is it possible to shape an SPD around this or not, to further support this policy area?
My understanding is that the work that is doing is essentially a list of all of the public open spaces. So in terms of listing those, then I suppose it would be, we're saying we're looking to protect public open space. If we have a list that includes those things on it, then that's helpful for us from a planning perspective. And it may be that there's a link in the supporting text which we could make to that. My only caution is that you want it to be all-encompassing, so it's a difficult ability to name every single piece of open space, and you don't want to give afford some more protection than another. So that's why our generic term in the policy is perhaps more helpful.
Right, members, are you happy with the way forward that's going to take place on this and the wording in the policy? Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. On to the item on affordable housing policy. As most members will be aware, there was a presentation last night given by consultants in respect of affordable housing viability and the links with the future seal charge. And the draft affordable housing policy was circulated to members on the 2nd of July. I've got spare copies if anybody doesn't have one with them tonight, so just let me know. Yeah. The draft policy directly responds to the findings of the consultants from last night. Just going back slightly, the draft policy directly responds to the findings of the consultants from last night and seeks a level of housing which is, broadly speaking, requirement for 30% affordable housing in Basingstoke and Tadley and 40% in the rest of the borough. And this reflects the variations in house prices and land values that you find in those areas. Members will note that the policy reduces the threshold for the provision of affordable housing down to 3 dwellings or more. This is a significant reduction from the current saved local plan policy, which seeks 15 homes in Basingstoke and 7 in other locations in the borough. Just to flag up, members should also be aware that in last night's presentation there was a slide which referred to a map of the borough, and that erroneously picked up Old Basing and Newnham in the wrong area. That was coloured blue and it should have been red, or vice versa. Just like to confirm that was incorrect, and the Newnham Old Basing area should relate to the rest of the borough and not to Basingstoke town in terms of land values, and the draft policy reflects that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Now, we only got the presentation last night, and it is asking an awful lot to start looking at a policy based on some of that information. What I intend to do is go around the table Sorry, Councillor Golding? Yeah. Yes, certainly, please come forward. But I just wanted to explain to the committee how we're going to play this. Because I'm going to go around the table, 4 minutes, questions to the officers, primarily. And we're going to record any comments, because the objective tonight is to obtain comments, your comments on the policy, to go forward to the Cabinet. Yes, Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Following last night's presentation and thinking through the policy when it was handed out the day before, and our group's discussion on it, we have a proposal, a series of comments to make, and actually another version, another policy version that we would like to introduce at some point during this. I've left it on desks, I've handed it out around the table this evening for most to look at. You should have it. It's titled Policy CM1 Affordable Housing. You'll have to copy on your desk. You should have it, hopefully. And at some point we'd like to at least introduce that to the conversation and propose it going forward.
I certainly don't have it.
It's my
Yeah.
No, I did it for, sorry, I did it for the committee. I'm sorry. You take it. Yeah.
Which of course leaves us in a dilemma. Which one do we look at? At the moment, we're going to be examining the policy as prepared by the officers. Then we will consider after that the Labour group, as I understand it, their proposed alternative. Has everybody got a copy of the Labour group's alternative? Okay. Well, let's kick off on this. Councillor Golding, you have, I'll give you 4 minutes, if you require it.
No, I think it'll be 2. Thank you. Evening. I invite the committee to reject the proposed reduction in our main affordable housing target from 40% to 30%. This is much too important a matter for us to make a decision without having had a chance to fully examine the issues. We only received the presentation yesterday. We've not yet had the report from 3 Dragons. None of us had a chance to properly consider their underlying assumptions and methodology. In any event, even taking their figures at face value, it's not at all clear that we need to reduce the 40% to 30%. 3 Dragons were very clear that for large sites, which they define as 400 plus dwellings, on the edge of Basingstoke, the appropriate residual land value is 400,000 per hectare. And their figures showed that, at that value, it is possible to require 40% affordable dwellings and still have scope for a sill charge and a buffer or a cushion, or whatever word they used. If you look at the sites on the edge of Basingstoke proposed by officers in the table on page 59 of 269 of the big document you're working through of the draft local plan, 3 of those sites have a capacity of 900 or more. Manydown, Basingstoke Golf Course and east of Basingstoke. Between them they would provide 4,980 dwellings. That's nearly 5,000 out of the total plan target of 7,581, which is on page 52 of 269. That means that 2/3 of the dwellings proposed in the local plan would be on sites that could sustain a 40% requirement for affordable housing. Moreover, 3 more sites on the edge of Basingstoke, north of Popley Fields, Kennel Farm and Razors Farm, have already been subject to planning applications in which the developers have said that the scheme is viable with 40% affordable housing. I think we should assume that the developers understand the viability of their own schemes better than the consultants. Those sites would provide another 1,120 dwellings out of the 7,581 required. Then you have all the housing proposed either on specific sites or through neighbourhood planning for the towns and villages outside Basingstoke, where 3 Dragons say that 40% affordable housing is viable. That's another 1,020 dwellings. By the time you add all that up, you have 7,120 dwellings out of the total requirement of 7,581, where we could require 40% affordable housing and still leave scope for a sill charge and a buffer or cushion or whatever it was. So I fail to see why we should abandon the target. Officers have suggested to me that the 3 Dragons work shows that it is no longer possible to deliver all the affordable housing needed through the planning process. However, that's not what the NPPF says. Paragraph 47 of the NPPF says that the local plan itself must meet, quote, the full objectively assessed needs for market and affordable housing. The plan has to do that. In addition, I think if we start messing around with the 40% target at this stage, we risk undermining the whole basis for the calculation of the annual target of 748 dwellings. That target was calculated on the assumption that we would fully meet the housing need of our own residents and allow a margin for in-migration. If we were now to say that we could only meet 3/4 of the need for affordable housing, that's 30 rather than 40, we would, for our own residents, there would be no justification for replacing that by an increased number of market dwellings, which could only lead to higher in-migration and even greater strain on the borough's infrastructure and natural resources. So in conclusion, even on Three Dragons' own figures, the vast majority of dwellings proposed for the planned period would be on sites where a 40% affordable housing target is viable. We should retain that policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Golding. Thank you. It'd be nice to know this in advance, Councillor Tilbury. Yeah, but it's still notification to the committee services is required, up to half an hour before the meeting.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I won't repeat what Councillor Golden said because he said most of what I was going to say, including the bit on the MPPF, which is very clear. It must ensure the local plan meets the full objectively assessed needs for the market and affordable housing. That's pretty clear, isn't it? They said the only way you can do that if you reduce it that amount is to build even more houses to get that smaller amount. So what I will talk about is the viability. If you remember some years ago, myself, I think Paul, Keith, and I think Marilyn were involved. We had a viability single issue panel that looked at viability, and we looked at all this sort of issue about viability because it was starting to come out then because of the financial crisis, and this is just the same thing again. So I mean, as the market picks up, a lot will go away. They'll come up with a new scam, the developers. But the trouble is with this, that's, you know, you can twist the figures to read whatever you want, and the argument that 30% isn't viable is nonsense. And we know 40% is viable in the villages because there's a planning application in my ward now, not at 20 dwellings per hectare, at 40, and that's 40% affordable housing, and the developer says that's viable. So that part of it is right, but I can't see how it's not viable in the main town area, and if it isn't, it's going to cause us a load of other problems, as Councillor Golden's just said. So thank you very much for that.
Right, this time I'm going this way around the table. I'm going to set off with Councillor Peach, and this is commenting on the officer's draft of policy CN1.
Okay. Essentially, from my point of view, a lot has been said now by Councillor Golding as well, and Councillor Tilbury. The one element I would pick up in terms of a comment is I'm not so sure about the reduction from 10 and 15 down to 3. I'm just worried whether it's smaller scale developments that, you know, whether that's going to prohibit going forward, and whether it's sensible, because the percentage of 3 is it's minimal, whereas if you've got at least 10 or 15 properties, at least you're getting a meaningful number of properties coming out of it. Yeah, I think most of it's been said. I'm not going to waste any more time.
Thank you. Councillor Mitchell.
Good evening, and I really will say very little at this stage about this because I missed yesterday's presentation, and I find having to get my head round one set of figures here, another proposition that's circulated, and a completely different input from speakers is intrinsically difficult. What I would say about the policy as drafted, the one circulated by officers, is that I think it is inappropriate to talk about percentages where you're dealing with very small numbers. It doesn't work, and if you have taking 30% as the examples, because I'm not going to personally debate the percentage, I listen to other people's informed views, but taking 30% as the example, till you get to around 25 houses, there is a very enormous variation between numbers and what you get out of it. So at the level of 3, 30% of 3 is up 0.9, And if you've got to provide at least 0.9, you've got to provide 1. So it's 1/3, it's not 30%. When you get to 6, for example, it's 1.8 is the percentage, which presumably means you've got to provide 2, because you can't provide 0.8 of a house. So, but I think we could have an interesting debate with an applicant about that, and an applicant could have an interesting debate with an inspector at appeal, and developers and others could have interesting debates with the inspector at the inquiry into the local plan. I would urge that when you're dealing with small numbers, you set out a table of requirements rather than setting percentages, and that you only set percentages when you get to larger numbers. So, for example, 30% of 25 is 7.5, and the difference between providing 7 or 8 is not enormous, but at the level of 4, 30% effectively, if you want a minimum of 30%, ask you to provide 50%. Now that means that whenever somebody's building 4, it's almost certainly that the provision will be found unviable. So you're back to the argument again, and we are creating a situation which leads to endless argument. We all know how dissatisfied members are with viability and pleas from developers that I can't do it, Gov. And I think setting out small numbers in this way with percentages leads to exacerbating that. So I would urge, whatever the percentage, have a table of what you actually expect for numbers below about 20 something, rather than silly percentages that don't make a lot of sense.
I've had an indication from officers they're quite happy to do that. Councillor Stucker.
I was going to go off about the percentages, so if that's sorted, that's great. And I just would like to just say I support what Councillor Golding has said.
Thank you. Councillor.
Thank you. I also would support Councillor Golding, but looking at the numbers we have here, I would change 3 to 5, picking up Councillor Peach's point, change the first 30% to 40%, which means there is no difference between whether it's within or without the Basingstoke SPB, and we can merge the two. But I think 40% is a figure which should remain.
Thank you. Councillor Leake.
The answer is I don't know, because I wasn't able to ask the questions which I wished I would have been able to do so last night, because I do feel we need to know how much sill we require. I mean, we have been banging on ever since I've been a councillor about we will not have any more development unless we've got the infrastructure. Now, the only way we're going to get the infrastructure is from the sill, as I understand it anyway. And at the moment, I certainly didn't understand how much money would come from the sill, and I'm not sure that, well, I was promised an answer, I think, but I'm still waiting for it. So I find it difficult to say whether we should be going for 30% to make sure we get the sill, or whether we should be agreeing with Councillor Golding that 40% is the desirable number. So I'm not really prepared to go one way or the other, but I'm absolutely adamant that we must make sure that we have enough money to enable us to implement things like the transport mitigation schemes, which are going to be expensive. I would actually, as I indicated last night, like to see them go further, and on some roundabouts have underpasses, which could certainly speed it up. But the infrastructure money is extremely important in my view, and until we've got an answer on that one, I'm not really prepared to go with either 30 or 40. I sympathise with the view about 40 because it is an important issue. On the small sites, personally, for development outside the Basingstoke settlement policy boundary, I would actually go back to 10, because in many of these areas we could have exception sites anyway, in addition to taking the 30 or whatever the percent is, 40% on those specific sites.
So, and I think to have 3 just really isn't the right solution, particularly in some of the rural areas. I'd much prefer to see 10, hoping that we would also have exception sites as well. Thank you.
I was just going to come back on the point about SIL paying for all the infrastructure. It's fairly typical for most authorities that when you prepare your infrastructure delivery plan, that the costing of all the infrastructure that's required is significant, and you wouldn't generally hope that SIL would cover the cost of all that infrastructure. It won't. What generally happens is you need to demonstrate to the inspector that you have a gap, what you can provide between SIL and what you require, and you would look to fill that gap through other funding regimes, such as the Hampshire County Council Capital Programme, other funding sources like the government, the LEP, or the local transport board. So we'd have to be active in making bids to those organisations for funding to top up what SIL will provide.
Just come back on that. I hear what you say, but we have a great deficiency in terms of infrastructure in this town, and indeed the whole borough. And until we actually know what that gap is, and then I would not happy to say 30 or 40, because clearly we were advised last night if we go for 30% we get a lot more SIL. If we go for 40% we get a lot less. And that gap between what we really need and what will come from the SIL could be enormous. So I hear your views, but I still want to know what the numbers are, so to get some feel of what we have to raise.
No, I'd like to move on. I'll come round to the table again. If we've got the time tonight, we'll come back. But it might be a quickie, but we're going to lose track of where we're going here. This is why we do it this way. Councillor Cubitt.
I completely agree with Councillor Leake, and I'm on record a number of times
These
saying...
are questions to the officers,
yes,
please.
No, I know that. I'm on record a number of times saying that the SIL figure and the structural deficit needs to be accounted for and worked at, and I don't accept, Mark, that we will get it from Hampshire County Council. We had an article in the Gazette today where Councillor Perry talks about the fact that their funding has been dramatically reduced by 100 million, and we have experiences in our borough already of 20 years of promises of infrastructure that's never come, such as the resurfacing of the M3, which was promised to the...
Please, could you ask a question of the officers? We understand...
Yes.
This is a lot of statements that you're making at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say also, a couple of members just said no one else has been required to ask a question. I'm the only one that's being required to ask a question.
Started this whole evening off, Councillor Cubitt, with this is a question session to the officers to clear up any clarification or whatever you want in this policy.
Okay. Well, Councillor Tucker said she didn't like the 3. Councillor Peach said they didn't like the 3. They didn't ask the officers why the number being reduced to 3. So that's the first question. Second question is, how can we establish 30% as opposed to 40% when we don't know how we're going to plug the deficit that will be the SIL? Thirdly, so that's the second question. And thirdly, how have we arrived at the 10-year split? Because I'm a passionate advocate of considerably more social rented and less affordable. So how is that 70% rented and 30% intermediate products being arrived at? That's the third question. And the fourth question is this. I thought that the affordable housing need of 300 houses per annum was arrived at independent of the 748, and Councillor Golding has made them linked, which we have always been explicitly told was a coincidence and just happened to be 40% of 748. So I'd also like to hear your views on that. Thank you.
I'll start with the first question. I may have missed the second, so you might have to repeat that. But in terms of the threshold and why 3 has been selected, it's because it's viable. and we want to take the opportunity to deliver affordable housing on smaller schemes where we can. So it's helping to actually deliver things on the ground, where opportunities arise. That might be the third. I think that the 10-year split has been arrived at from what's been found in the SHMA and the advice of the officer in that respect, and as advised to the committee last month.
Plugging the gap with SIL. It was plugging the gap with SIL was your second question. Do you want to do the plugging the gap? I can do it. These are interlinking the two reports, but the schedule you've got in terms of the infrastructure delivery plan starts to show you the total cost of infrastructure. And within that would start to identify that you've got a funding gap. And so within that gap, you then have to identify how much you think SIL would pay for towards that infrastructure. And then the gap would be filled, you would have to seek to fill that with things like new homes bonus, government grants, that type of stuff. So the infrastructure delivery plan gives you that identification of where that link is. The points that were being made last night about the link between affordable housing and infrastructure costs are that if you have a very high affordable housing requirement, that may inhibit your ability to collect SIL at all. And so you need to have a careful balance and look at it. And that's why the consultants last night, you provided all those tables that showed the different kinds of levels of SIL you might get. We've looked at other organisations in the locality as to how much they're collecting per square metre. And there's a variety of a sort of a 0 through to about 200, which seems to be about the right level. And then you work that out on a basis across the piece of how much you might make each year from SIL, and then you'd be left with a gap that you'd have to fill through those other mechanisms. But it may be that we'll come on to that under the infrastructure delivery plan part.
A follow-up to that one specifically. I thought that under the coalition government and the whole reshaping of the Section 106, the SILs, the new homes bonuses, blah, 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 was in order that we wouldn't have gaps going forward, because we know that the UK government is bankrupt. We know that there are a number of councils who aren't as lucky as we are and sitting on a 100 million investment portfolio and a 250 million commercial real estate portfolio. So we therefore know that, and I thought that one of the central tenets of the coalition government's kind of instruction to councils through the MPPF et al. Was that the gap would have to be financed from developers' contributions plus new homes bonus, that we couldn't look to a third way because that third way will not be there. And it makes me very nervous when I hear you say that, not Andrew, but Mark said it earlier to Councillor Leake, that the SIL won't fund the infrastructure gap that's going to arise from these new homes. So it's a bit like the nuclear power stations. It's like the developers swan off into sunset with a nice little profit, and they leave us with all the problems, and their shareholders take all the divvies, and that's exactly why we've got ourselves in the pig's mess we're in at the moment. And the government's deficit ain't improving at a speed which is going to mean that they're going to start issuing bonds for us going forward.
I think the MPPF, which is obviously the government's guidance, is quite clear about policy burdens and viability and how much we can seek to achieve through SIL. I'll just give an example of other councils where they've got a plan in place, they've got a SIL in place, they've got growth happening, and they are tending to be successful in their bids to government for money to support infrastructure. So I cite Wokingham as an example. I think they've just recently received 20 million towards infrastructure. So until you've got that, you're in that position where you've got a plan in place, you've identified your SIL, you're using your new homes bonus effectively, all of those sorts of things, you can then use your bidding to say, listen, government, this is what we need to where we need to fill some gaps. This is where we would like to see some money come forward. So it's about all of that process, but SIL certainly doesn't fill the gap, and it certainly shouldn't be set at the margins of viability, which was a clear point from last night. So it's a mechanism. It may provide more than Section 106 has provided in the past, but it's not the it's not the panacea for meeting all infrastructure costs. Oh, it was more, yeah, I mean, in terms of when we were looking at the needs, and we were looking at those together in terms of the 748. So the 748 was your total need, and within that you would provide some affordable housing that would meet the needs of at least those on bands 1 to 3. And if you did with that through a 40% planning affordable percentage, you could achieve that. Equally, you could achieve affordable housing through a number of other mechanisms. So planning isn't the only mechanism in which you can provide affordable housing.
Thank you, Andrew. I've said on a number of occasions that I think it's not a criticism of you or your team, but that by doing the 30% or 40%, we're like a rat in a rat wheel, and we're chasing our tail, and then there are developers renegotiating deliveries on affordables, and the real problem we have in the southeast of England, we all know, is we haven't got enough social rented housing for our people, right? So if instead of going for a policy like this, is there a third way, which is that we apply the 70-30 split? I mean, I've mentioned this on public record before, on the developers, so we get the chunk of the SIL for the investment. So 70-30 for developers, normal developers, and then the residual chunk, a SIL to pay for our infrastructural deficit that will be generated from their housing they're building. And then approach publicly owned land in a different way and meet the 300 bottom up, not top down. And that way we wouldn't be going for 748 if it wasn't a coincidence that 748 was met because it produced the magic number 300, which the Schmar said we needed in affordable homes. If we started bottom up and said we need 300 homes because that's a given, and of those 300 homes, X percent will come from the 70-30 split, and the residual bit, the bit that we can't meet through the developer private land holdings, will be met through build and rent to Sovereign or Sentinel, and in terms of dealing with public held land in a separate way. Is that doable? Because the coalition government keeps on saying, we want council-owned land to have affordable homes built on it. They keep on saying that.
Probably not. I can't give you an answer from a landowning perspective. I can give you an answer from a perspective as a planning authority. Planning authority, we can simply seek what we can seek through development. If a landowner decided that they wanted to do something different, more philanthropic or whatever, that would be for the landowner to do. And if for instance they wanted to make those points to us as a local planning authority to say, actually on this particular site we as landowner will be doing X, and we would like that reflected in your policy for our site, for instance, then that's something we could think about. But from a local planning authority perspective, we're devising policies that are strategic across the piece, which don't have they're not related to who owns the land, they are related to development, if you see what I mean.
I've got to stop you there, Mrs. Cubitt, because we're going around the table. You've had more than your 4 minutes. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Andrew, Mark, the fact that there's no reference in the policy to the Schmar is something I'd like to pick up to start with. It is in the supporting notes, but it's not directly referenced in the policy itself. So from a developer perspective, looking at this, our most important piece of evidence, in my opinion, that relates to this policy area isn't directly referenced in the policy itself. So for me, looking at this, again, from a lawyer's perspective of how are they going to look at this when they approach it and try to unpick it, I want it absolutely fireproofed in that sense, really, and I'll come back to that point again in the future, I think. In saying that, I think the interesting about last night, I want to park last night, because I have got absolutely no faith in what was said last night. I do not in any way, shape or form recognise that presentation as a true picture at all. I appreciate the evidence, it's what they think is, and that's fine. And they presented it in good faith in the way they did last night, that's fine. But having done some research on this and looked at some other authorities and their approaches, I've got some pretty fundamental problems with what they were saying, and it's interesting other authorities have had similar problems with that kind of approach and have gone really where Councillor Golding was suggesting. The SHMA is far more important and reflects an issue really of priority. Put the figures to one side because I can unpick that to my heart's content. In terms of the three, the interesting about the three, I think, in terms of the policy as it's written, is the idea that you do get a lot of small developers who are, the smaller companies of this world, who will come forward with your 5s, your 10s, your 15s. They are more than able to deliver an affordable housing policy because they're a company that have got multiple sites across the country, and their South East regional office may well be very capable of meeting the needs of Basingstoke and delivering it. Individual developers who come from a very different perspective from company-based, industry-based development, that I can understand where Councillor Mitchell may have an issue, and others have said that. And that's where your three comes in a sense, because if you've only got a smaller provincial developer coming in with your three, yeah, but the point is we still need to have a contribution. We still need them to do their bit. So the issue here, I think, is where you draw the line. Now, is it 5 or is it 10 or is it 3? I don't think it's 15. That's too much. I don't think it's past 10 by any stretch of the imagination. And I think there's a very important line to be drawn here, and I want to see some evidence more than we've got necessarily, I think, to be properly judged in getting it right, really. In terms of 30 to 40% split between the urban and the rural, I do not support that by any stretch of the imagination. The idea that the urban area can take 30%, but everything in the rural gets 40. I mean, some of our regeneration areas, those 40%, that figure, and to be fair, beyond that, and we could be far more aspirational than this. Truly, compared to what the SHMA was telling us, I think that in a sense is an issue. So I disagree with those two paragraphs fundamentally. 10-year split. Well, the obvious point and the direction of our evidence is that the 70% should, in the very first instance, be socially rented. It shouldn't be simply 70% rented. Our starting point with anything needs to be the need established in our evidence base, and that is for socially rented housing. That report from Di Bromley was superb. It was absolutely superb, and we have got a very strong case to be made from that in our own officers' work. We didn't need to pay any consultant to come in and tell us to do that. That was our own officers doing a superb piece of work with evidential base, I think, in terms of figures and statistics and incomes, all of that evidence base that adds up to that needs to be 70% socially rented to start with. The paragraph below there, Andrew, interesting mark, in seeking affordable housing provision, the Borough Council will have regard to the current viability of developments, including land values and other development costs. The issue I've got with that is, while that is a relevant part of the NPPF, in stating that as clearly as we do in the policy, you then set the developer up to say, I'm terribly sorry, but I've got a viability issue, and every single developer will come to you and say, I've got a viability issue. They will play that tune, they'll play that string to its heart. And I think for me, that's an issue in terms of not appreciating the principle, because I do. It's just, I don't think we should say that in that way in the policy. I think there's a much better way of capturing the principle of the NPPF that we have to look to. The issue about off-site contributions is interesting, that bottom paragraph.
This is editing the document at the moment instead of asking questions of the officers, Councillor Harvey.
Well, I'm just following the trend of what other members did. I appreciate the officers' response to what I'm saying, really. If they want to come back to me, that's...
But I think if we can couch all these and put a predicator in the front of it, that these are questions to the officers.
Yeah.
Because you're questioning what is in the draft policy.
I'm happy with that. In terms of the bottom bit, I guess it's the sequential bit from sentence to sentence to sentence as you work through it, as you would work through it.
Actually, your microphone keeps wandering away from your speech.
Sorry.
It was very quiet.
The bottom paragraph there, in terms of sentence to sentence to sentence, it's the linkages of all of that in the way you would work through it. The applicant required to submit open book viability. That's important. I think they should have to submit that anyway, because we need to see that in the context, if we're going to have these, because those calculations will go on. So all development in terms of the open book, the viability assessments will be there in terms of the provision and the split, whether they can provide it or not. And they seek to provide contribution in lieu of off-site affordable. Well, the one thing we don't do, and I've not seen, is how that is then negotiated. Where is the policy formulation to negotiate? Where is the detail of how we go about engaging with the developers in this? It's not in the supporting text, necessarily, in the way I'd like it to be, and it isn't in the policy. And my final point is, where we accept this, where the LPA says it's going to accept it. Approach contributes to creating mixed and balanced communities. We're back into that. It's just the language, I guess, really. It's what do we mean by that, and what would it be reinterpreted as a developer looking at trying to get out of delivering affordable housing? Because I'm not being rude to developers, but most of them don't want to deliver it because it's not where their business is. Their business is in building as many market units as they can to sell. And that's an issue for us, that we need to hold them to account for the affordable housing element that we genuinely need. Appreciate Andrew and Mark's response to that.
That's why simple questions are much easier to handle, because we get lost in a lot of the detail escapes us.
What was your just a few thoughts on that. We haven't tended to put references to evidence base in each of the policies. We've tended to put that in the supporting text, and I don't think that gives it any less weight. And certainly in determining planning applications, for instance, you would refer the developer to those particular pieces of information. In terms of our own evidence in the SHMA, I think you're right. The social rent in certain circumstances is the most affordable. But equally, I think our evidence also demonstrates that there are places where affordable rent is actually cheaper in some circumstances than social rent, depending on the type of tenure. In terms of the now I'm losing just one thing on the. Yeah, the 3D units is based on the information we've got from the Three Dragons work to date, taking on board the comments that people have made already on that, and about the determining a financial equivalent. I think that certainly on the 1 to 3 we would have to have a standard approach for doing that if you were collecting a monetary amount. The other thing probably just to say is what we're trying to do with this policy, and why we brought this information to you last night, is there has to be a clear understanding that the MPPF is clear to us. We can't put over policy burden development. It has to be viable to come forward. It sets that out in the MPPF, and Dominic last night used that particular paragraph, which is key to all of that. What we're trying to say is you've got some difficult decisions as members in terms of saying, if we're going to go for a high affordable housing requirement, are we willing to take a lower SIL requirement? That's the point of it. And I think in terms of this, it's within our professional responsibility to bring that to you. In fact, there's the MPPF there. So we certainly accept that there may be other ways of you may want to reframe the policy, but we want you very clearly to be thinking about how viability might be affected by this policy.
Just quickly to come back on that, I appreciate what you're saying, and of course it's your responsibility as the officers to give us that information in the way you feel it's appropriate. No questioning of that. What I do question, and what I have an issue with, is the line on viability in this. And in terms of what other authorities have found, and I'm going to experience now, I'm going to what has actually happened on the ground in a number of London authorities where this has been the case, and in a number of rural districts where this has been the case, you see that the delivery of the affordable housing has not had an impact on their contributions, on their approach to it. And in fact, the delivery is sometimes actually being able to meet their aspiration, not just the bottom line. And I think in terms of, and particularly in terms of Lambeth and Southwark, I'm looking at those two as good examples of an experience. And admitted they're in the London setting. Of course they're in the London setting, but that doesn't deviate from the positive information, the evidence we can look to and their experience. I think their officers have got a very good line on it, where the point is the land values can flex. The one thing that didn't flex last night was the developer side. Everything else flexed. There wasn't a single bit of flexibility as far as the developers were concerned. Well, in the real world there is. In the real world, with officers negotiating with developers site by site by site, as you well know, you can achieve a significant amount of your policy requirements. So why set yourself up to fail in the first place? Set the bar here to come down. Don't set the bar down here, having to come up, because you can never come up. And that's the issue, really, is how far we go down that road. Appreciating what you say, and I do understand what you're saying.
Just to come back on that, the advice we've been given is that if your policy requirement is high, when you get to your SIL, so you might get that through an examination. When you get to the SIL charging schedule, once there's no viability left, you may be unable to set a SIL. So you've got to look at the interplay between the two when you're setting your policy, and I think that's the key point about last night, is trying to make people aware that there's that linkage.
Just finish up. Yes, I agree there's the linkage. I disagree with the conclusions that were drawn, and the experience that I've looked at and the experience that's out there now tells a different story. Thank you.
Councillor Mr. James.
My first question is, can I have a copy of the scoping document for the Three Dragons and the piece of work? Could you please email me that?
Yep, sure.
Can I also, my next question is, who was it? Three Dragons who asked the membership to attend from the developers?
That was officers. We invited as many people as we can on the basis that we want to get as fuller and frank discussion from developers and others in the industry as possible. We sent out the invitations. We aimed to get as many different types of developer there as possible, from registered social landlords, smaller house builders up to the volume house builders, including planning agents, surveying types, and anyone with some experience in terms of land values that would contribute to the process.
So can I ask, why was it predominantly made up of the private sector and not social landlords?
I think that reflects who was available on the day and who could actually attend, because we did send it to as many people as possible.
Sorry, just to say, as Dominic went through last night, I think there were 3 that represented the social registered landlords, and obviously the 2 big ones for us, plus HCA, were there. So I think it's a fairly reflective of the local situation to come along to that meeting.
Actually, it's probably worth saying that we also tried to engage with social landlords away from the workshop through the distribution of notes from the workshop to particular individuals who work for the housing associations, to engage with them informally as well.
The question that we raised it last night is, were you aware that Three Dragons, one of their listed clients is the House Building Association, which is a lobby group for small and medium-sized builders who have been vocal over the negative impact of community infrastructure levy?
Obviously, when we procure consultants, there's a point about conflicts of interest, and Dominic's come back to us this morning on that particular point, because it was the HBA was the company you mentioned. He said the HBA was specifically mentioned yesterday. I'm able to tell you that Three Dragons undertook work with them in 2010-11, looking into the economics of development across sites. The HBA work is complete, and we have no financial or contractual relationship with that organisation, although we'd be happy to work with them in the future.
So we have asked an organisation to do a piece of work, who did a piece of work with small developers, which were looking at the impact of community levy. You know, for me, I have grave concerns about the evidence base of this piece of work that we was presented last night, and as Paul says, I cannot support that, what was given, and it clearly had a developer inference. Can you not understand their concerns as members?
I think an equal concern we would have had if we'd used someone who had no development experience, then we certainly wouldn't have had the full picture, and we certainly wanted to make sure that we had a company that had both public and private experience and understood the businesses and how land values and etc. are dealt with. And again, I'll quote from something that Dominic said. It seems quite clear to us that the work we undertake for the private sector provides insight and valuable information that benefits the work undertaken for the private sector, for the public sector. This includes access to commercially sensitive information that provides a reference to similar situations in other locations. There have been a number of occasions where we've undertaken viability work for local authorities and then been asked to prepare figures by the private sector in order to provide a common basis of discussion. We act as an honest broker.
In producing this policy before us, CN1, our office is aware of the report that was produced by one of our officers that said over the next 3 years, on average, we will be producing 91 affordable units.
Absolutely aware, yes.
Our office is aware of the adoption of of Oxford's, or have they had sight of Oxford adopted plan in February, where it says within that policy, there's that they've broken theirs down into affordable homes for larger sites, and then they have a policy for affordable homes for smaller sites. And on the larger site, and I want to link it back to what you're saying here tonight within CN1, it talks there about a 50% affordable homes delivery. A minimum 80% of affordable homes must be provided as social rented, with remaining affordable homes provided as intermediate housing. But I also want to go on to what it says and how it differs from the language that you use around viability. It says exceptions will be made only if it can be robustly demonstrated that this level of provision makes a site unviable, in which case developers and the city council will work through a cascade, and it goes on. So it's a much more definite, whereas as in relation to the viability is I think quite weak within that report. And then what it also does, it was in the affordable, it goes on to talk about small sites, and it's much more definite. Are you aware of how other authorities have achieved a much higher standard of delivery to meet their housing need? And have you looked at some of these across the country that are now doing this?
Yes, we do study other people's plans, and we pay careful attention, in particular, to the inspectors' reports that lead to the adoption of those plans. I suppose with planning policy, you have to be aware that every piece of evidence is locally specific, and whilst that may be relevant to Oxford and the land values and the issues in Oxford, it won't be relevant to Basingstoke because we've got different land values, different land supply, and different opportunities for development. I'm sure you're probably aware that Oxford's surrounded by green belt, so it's very limited in where it can go in the future, and that obviously has an implication for what type of development will take place there in going forwards.
Can I just ask, in relation to if we ask for a greater number of affordable units and we end up with a lesser amount of SIL, could we use the new homes bonus to top up the shortfall in SIL, the £23 million that we'll be getting over the next 6 years for new homes bonus?
It's hard to say that. It depends on how long, if new homes bonus is in place for a long period of time. SIL is a more standard way of doing that, and an approach that you would want to take as an authority, because it gives you certainty and security. Albeit that new homes bonus might be able to top on top of that, but you've got with a SIL charge, developer doesn't get to negotiate it; they have to pay it, and it's on a per metre square basis. So the smaller you make that, the less amount of money you have to spend on other infrastructure other than affordable housing.
But if there will be some developers that will be able to deliver a higher percentage, maybe even a higher percentage, and I think higher than 40, and there will be developers that can do that. If they can't through a cascade approach, and we end up with them not being able to do that, or if we end up with a lesser SIL, could we use the £23 million that we have to support that? Is there any reason why we couldn't use our 23 million new homes bonus?
Mrs. James, excuse me interrupting. We're now getting into an economic debate as to debating of how this policy is going to be drafted and included in the local plan. The officers present tonight are planning officers. They're not based on the economics of the borough. So could we concentrate on the draft policy as presented by officers, please? One more question, then I'm moving to Councillor Watts. Gary Watts.
my question is also around, and the concern I also have around the where it talks about in Basingstoke development sites of houses of 3 or more. In relation to later on when you talk about viability, is it not going to be the case that small developers are going to be able to put forward a case that they can't deliver against that requirement? I can't see any small developer. They're all going to come forward, and particularly the way that this policy is written, to say that their sites aren't viable and cannot deliver.
The 3 comes from the work that Three Dragons have done. So they looked at those sorts of levels of sites and whether they were viable, and the approach they said was yes, they were viable at that level, based on the values of today. So at this point in time, they would be viable.
Councillor Gale-Watts. Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to concentrate on SIL. Have we got any flexibility with SIL? And believe we set it for over a 15-year period. Is that correct?
You do set it for the planned period, but you're able to vary that if you go through the process of varying that again. So whilst it might be set in stone for a couple of years, if things change in the economy or land values start increasing, then you've got scope to go back and look at that again.
Justifies my point, really. We're coming with a very low figure. We've just coming out of, well, Chancellor says we're coming out of recession. And if his predictions are right, house land prices should increase. So it would become more viable. Talking about your policies within the settlement boundary, 30%, would that be the same for regeneration? Take the free regeneration schemes. There's one in Southam, Kings Road, one in an extension. I know those 2 reasonably well. They would have over 30% affordable homes there at the moment, and this policy would reduce the affordable homes in that particular area.
I think with the regeneration that's already happened, it's clear that this isn't a limiter on the amount of affordable housing that could be provided on any scheme. And certainly schemes like Oak Ridge and Taverner Fremantle have looked, because they are essentially re-provision of social affordable housing, you can see a much higher percentage achieved in those areas where you've got a social landlord in driving it forward. So it wouldn't limit that ability for a social landlord to take forward a scheme and have a much higher percentage of affordable housing.
Well, probably would, because we've got a policy of 30% within the settlement boundary. Now we've got a policy of 40%. I think it would lessen the scope what we've got at the moment.
As I say, in those particular areas that you're talking about, where you've got a social landlord who's in control of the land, it's generally, if they are taking it forward, they will be doing that for the purposes of providing more affordable housing. So they have the ability to do something which they could come forward with 100% affordable housing, and as a planning application, we would consider that.
We'll wait to see, won't we, in the future. If we were to adopt this policy of 30% within the settlement boundary, how many homes, I believe I read in the paper, it'd be 1,200 homes within the town it would affect, is that correct?
Do you mean in terms of how many? I'm not quite sure I know what you mean.
Because the presentation said, well, your policy says outside settlement boundaries, Chinham, the golf club are outside the settlement boundaries. We've got 1,000 and 1,200 who are in the settlement boundary. Is that a correct figure?
The allocations would then essentially become part of the Basingstoke area. That's essentially, they wouldn't be in the blue area. They would become part of Basingstoke. They would be within it. So they would be affected by that policy.
More statements than questions. You see, statements aren't really contributing to what we want to see in this policy.
No, I know.
It's the reason for the question session with the officers. Yeah, I'm just... are we going to have a... Well, all right then, I'll save my statements for the debate then. Fine.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll ask a couple of questions and probably comment later. First question was really about officers referred to the interrelationship between the amount of affordable housing we require, the community infrastructure levy, and other policies. Can officers, and I take the point that's already been made about the importance of informed decision making and having the relevant financial information so you can weigh up these different requirements. Will officers be able to do some financial modelling ahead of the cabinet meeting that gives the cabinet, and for that matter other elected members, the ability to analyse the relative costs of these different requirements and therefore reach an informed judgment about the balance of requirements? So that's my first question, if they can undertake this sort of financial modelling. My second question is really to pick up on Councillor Golding's comments, and he was obviously talking about the looking at the issue of the 40% requirement, based on empirical evidence of what has happened in the recent past, and therefore arguing partly on the basis of that, but also on the basis of analysing the Three Dragons report, that basically it was perfectly reasonable to have a requirement of 40%. And I'd invite officers to comment on the rationale that Councillor Golding advanced and their views on that rationale.
In terms of the financial part, I think when we come on to the IDP, it will start to show members the scale of the infrastructure costs, and there are some very back of envelope simple approaches that you can start to identify what sort of funding you might be needing over a particular period, and we can provide that to cabinet in making their decisions. But it would be very broad. In terms of the second part, it's probably worth getting that table up, isn't it? I think that this table was just the one that they talked about last night, which started to identify, for instance, that 40% with social rent, you were underneath the benchmark, and only very marginally viable at 35% with social rent. And so it's with affordable rent, 40% is at the margins of viability. So the likelihood of being able to charge a SIL at 40% is very difficult. So you can interpret that how you like, but I think that the experience of Three Dragons was that where you've got this very close relationship between the base value of the land, not the more aspirational one, that 40% is a particular challenge, particularly when you look at the social rent model as the leader, and these were at 75 on that side. It was a 75% social rent, 25% affordable rent, and vice versa on the other side. So you can start to see that viability is really affected, and it's that ability to flex above that to enable you to then provide a SIL charge.
As I recall, what Councillor Golding was saying was, well, look, the sites that are proposed for allocation and which represent, by far the greatest part of the likely level of house building over the planned period, is in larger developments where the land value is lower than on other developments, and therefore Councillor Golding was saying, well, surely in practice there is viability at this figure of 40%. So was Councillor Golding not correct in terms of the his reference to the site-specific nature of these levels of viability?
I can simply comment on what was presented last night. I think when we went and looked at the case studies, we were looking at those where there was some with a very marginal. And I don't know whether I can just find those. So, for example, I think, let me just see, these are Basingstoke edge sites. Oh, no, that's the hectare tile. So on this example, it provided you with the 30 and 35% and the kind of level of sill you might get. And obviously, if you had a 40% on there, then the level of sill, and as they said, there was quite a margin of buffer on those figures. You could find yourself with a very, very low sill figure if you were going beyond that at sort of 40%.
Councillor Shaw. Councillor Keith-Wallace.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to take a completely different turn. Well, exactly. I'm going to ask a question. I could give a long litany of who I agree with and who I don't with, and we'd be here till midnight. Is it possible within this policy or another policy, perhaps urban design, to set standards for the distribution of affordable housing through a development? Ever since the developer committed to 40%, I've encouraged the proposed development at Blosswood Lane, which is WIP 006, and I'm very disappointed to see the planning application clusters the affordable homes in the corner closest to the A34 trunk road. Can we specify? Well, in fact, oddly, the design statement for the same application says they will be distributed without the site. So, can we set such a standard?
I don't see that being a problem, certainly in terms of the site policies, because you may well want to be very specific about the types of splitting it up, not having clusters, or whatever it might be. And in the explanatory text of this policy, I'm sure that could be dealt with.
Right, I've got a couple of questions. We're banding around this expression of viability. Now, we had a presentation last night on affordable housing viability. In the policy CM1, in the last paragraph, we have the applicant will be required to submit an open book viability assessment. Now, that's a viability assessment from a developer. Would that be the same viability assessment as presumably the local planning authority would go through the exercise similar to the one that was presented to us by Three Dragons last night? And how do these two viability results, assessments, match up? Because if you're doing viability on housing, you've got to compare apples and apples and not apples and bananas.
I think it should use the same methodology because it's a standard approach to undertaking this type of work. The issue with the more local one, maybe that it may be able to pick up more distinctive characteristics relating to that particular site, whereas of course ours is looking at examples. Effectively, I'm confirming that it's the same methodology, albeit the one relating to a site will be more site-specific and may pick up particular characteristics linked to that site.
Councillor Mrs. Cubitt, please would you allow the officers to speak? I don't know why you interrupt or carry on separate conversations, but please could you keep that till after the meeting's over? Thank you.
Same methodology, Chair. But obviously the one linking to the site will pick up local characteristics.
You mentioned that, I took it from your response there, that the methodology that was used last night, you mentioned the word, it's a standard approach. Is this the kind of approach that most local authorities use to go into their plans, and presumably they have to present this for the examination by the inspector?
It is, Chair. We're aware that Three Dragons have been involved in other core strategies, local plans, and in fact they've got sound policies in that respect. The inspector's looked at their policies and considers them to be acceptable.
Thank you. I must admit, I think I got most of the gist from last night, but I really need to sit down myself and go through it. I have the same questions about the 3 number, and I will echo some of the comments that were made around the table. Mathematically, I have a problem with it. Yes, I can understand how 3 dragons probably got to 3, but in practical terms, I think we need to examine that a bit more and have some simple arithmetic applied, and it might be a bit easier for people to grab hold of. What it was... Thank you for reminding me, Councillor Cubitt. Can I ask you that the 70% rented in the 3rd paragraph, the 10-year split of affordable homes will be 70% rented and 30% intermediate products. Now, you've deleted out the local needs variation that might be applied. Are you just making it that a high-level statement in the policy?
I think we were just trying to pick up there that rather than being specific about the type of rented, we just used rented because it could be social or affordable. And it was just a very clear statement as to what you were looking for. I think members were looking for us to be very clear and straightforward on those points.
Okay, thank you. Right, members, you've had a chance, members, to ask questions of the officers. What I would like to do now is Cabinet, what the outcome of all this is meant to have comments to the Cabinet around this policy, and bearing in mind what we've heard around the table, I'm going to go around the same way again, and to ask you what your individual comments are about wording or anything else in this policy. Councillor Mrs. Cubitt.
It's just you were asking what I was talking about, and I was just going to tell you that.
I'm sorry, but I'm not interested. I'd like to move on with this committee meeting.
It's in relation to your question. It's about how does a developer decide its viability. Well, in Italy...
Mrs. Cubitt, I don't want to hear it, please. Neither does the committee. Councillor Peach, would you have any comments, please, on policy CN1, affordable housing, that can contribute, that we can capture, we can agree within the committee, and go forward to Cabinet?
Yeah, to repeat, the first comment was around the setting the numbers low at around 3, and just trying to revise that. And I think Councillor Mitchell put that quite eloquently, more so than myself. The other side of it, which I needed, I'm not sure I can capture it in a comment perhaps, and the bit I needed to understand from my own point of view was, if you set the CIL, the affordable at 40%, is the CIL then fixed in the plan, but the 40% is still negotiable? And I'm not sure that's a comment, but it was just something I needed clarified in my mind so I could understand further the consequences of what's there.
So, sorry, you were saying...
If we set the affordable at 40%, does that then fix the CIL in advance in the local plan that therefore cannot be changed, but a developer can then come and renegotiate the 40%?
If 40% was set in the plan and then you got to your charging examination on CIL and it said, well, because of your requirements, you're not going to be able to charge a CIL, so you would no longer have you wouldn't have a CIL charging schedule, but you'd have the 40%, so you prioritised affordable housing. If viability improved over the period of time, you may well then be able to introduce at a later stage a new CIL charging schedule that maybe could collect a CIL, but your 40% would have remained the same. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, what it sounds like is that if it starts looking better, then you can renegotiate it. But essentially, once it's in there, you potentially. What I'm saying is, with really good intention, we could lift this percentage up, and I think there seems to be general support for that. However, if we do that, do we find ourselves in a position that we no longer have any CIL that we cannot negotiate on, and we end up with an affordable figure that is negotiated upon? So we lose both ways.
I suppose if there was a viability issue around a particular site and you weren't collecting a CIL and the 40% was still a problem, then yes, you may have to have some negotiation around that. But what we're trying to get across, I think, is making sure that our policies don't inhibit us and in our ability in the future to collect SIL is the point.
So perhaps that can just be captured in a comment about,
Can I just be clear so we don't mess up for the minutes and then you go, oh, we capture the gist of the conversation at this stage, but at the end of this discussion, we would be looking for the committee to collectively agree what it would like to recommend to Cabinet, as we did in all the other policies.
And I understand the scepticism about that, but we've got to do it tonight. By the way, I'm aiming to move on to the IDP at 8:30. So if we don't finish it tonight, we don't do our job. It's simple as that. So, and we've got rural exception sites to address as well. So, Councillor Peach, do you want to put something onto the table on this? Do you want to change the 30 to 40? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I think 40% seems about right. But I do have a big concern around doing it if it leaves us in a vulnerable position, because we know we've got an infrastructure problem already in the borough, and I would hate to try to be aspirational and then only to find that we end up losing out. So for me, I think there's an element of caution perhaps going forward.
Thank you for that. Councillor Mitchell?
Thank you, Chairman. Just two or three comments. It seems to me that although I wasn't here, I'm getting the gist of what came out of the presentation. And to me, that is what I'd call useful evidence, but it's just a particular type of evidence, and we've got plenty of evidence of all sorts of other things, and any evidence has to have the test of common sense. And I didn't actually, although somebody picked up that they thought I had, I didn't actually comment on whether 3 was a good number first time around. I was just asking whether officers agreed that that a percentage of 3 didn't make a lot of sense, and they did, fortunately. It seems to me that although a site might be deemed in principle to be viable at the level of 3 to have an affordable home, it could be challenged that it makes sense to start with the level of 3 and say that every site that has 3 must have an affordable home, which is effectively what this policy says. As written, it says it must have 2 affordable homes, but I'm sure that wasn't the intention, and therefore we assume that's just an error that can be corrected. I don't believe personally that 3 is a good start point number. I would agree with those who've said 5 is a better start point number for all sorts of reasons, but I won't deter you. I won't delay you with those comments. The other thing is the higher proportion on the same number in rural areas doesn't make any sense, in my view. And I'll come to an explanation in a second, but it seems to be intrinsically wrong in principle that we ask for a higher proportion of affordable homes where there is lower demand for affordable homes. And I've got plenty of evidence that that's the case. And I use the word demand because what we don't want to do is to force residents who live in the town to upshift and move to places where they haven't got easy access to all the facilities they're used to in town, and their grandma and their neighbours and all the other things. I'm not against them moving into the rural areas, but they're very welcome. But I know a number who have had to find the debt to do that, and a lot don't want to do it. We have very clear evidence of that from other sources. My third point about that is that it's very dangerous to take this sort of calculation without thinking through what the implications are. And when an application comes to development, the developer has already negotiated the land price that he thinks he's going to get with the owner. Often the developer is the owner. He's become the owner, or he's got contractual rights to become the owner at a particular price. So we're negotiating against a preconceived land price. Now, in the rural areas of the borough, to some extent in the town, but particularly in the rural areas, demand for new property in the market is elastic. There is unlimited demand. And if a landowner sees that this is the way things are going. What happens is, if you put affordable homes in at too small a level, what you're doing is increasing the price of the property. And the prices in the property in the rural areas are already higher in the town and too high for people to afford to move into them. So there's a bit of a catch-22 there. And I do think it makes no common sense at all to have a higher proportion of affordable homes in the rural areas. I'd quite happily accept the same proportion, but higher makes no sense to me. And if I may, I'll put two other points for the Cabinet to consider. Others may not agree with either of these. But I would ask the Cabinet, because I'm not going to ask questions now, but I would ask the Cabinet to ask the officers the question, what would happen if the landowner told us now that he planned to put 50% affordable homes on Manydown? And the reason I'm asking that question is the way the policy is currently worded, you're not allowed to do that. It says 30% will be provided. It doesn't say at least. So my advocation is that it should say at least, so that owners, including us, are allowed to put in the number we think is best for the town and the people and the development. And the other thing, which I'll ask the officers offline, because I don't want to start that process again now, is what happens, because I haven't the slightest idea, when SIL comes in, it takes away some of the money from what's been known as Section 106, but do we still have a tariff for smaller developments? Or does the tariff disappear and we've got to negotiate every single dwelling again, which we tried to get out of? I think that was it. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Hunter, I think you want to say something on that.
Sorry, just to say that the SIL is a tariff essentially, and it applies to every development, and it's on a metre square basis, so, and it's non-negotiable. So Section 106 is only very small elements of it are left for kind of on-site type provision. You can't pool it anymore. It's mainly used on larger sites, for instance.
I actually agree with Horace on the 5 number, starting at 5. And equally, I think I'm pretty well in the same place as Councillor Peach regarding the rural and the town areas.
Yes, Councillor.
Thank you. If I could slip a question in at this stage on the tariff. Whether the tariff is whether we set the minimum at 3 or 5. If it is below that number, you say SIL applies above and below, but above the number you've also got to provide affordable housing, and below it you haven't. So is there a distinction there? I'd just like clarification on that, because when we set a number, let's call it 5, if you're building 4, are you saying SIL is all you pay, you don't pay anything towards affordable housing? Because I thought you did. I still think 5 is the right number, because small developers frankly just want a quick sale on their properties. They don't want to be tied into affordable elements. And I would say again that 30% in the town is wrong. It should be 40, and let's combine the two policies.
Thank you. Do you have any comment about that?
Just coming back on the question about SIL and affordable housing, you don't pay SIL on affordable housing. It's exempt.
But if I could offer what the question was, if with this at 5, you build 3, do you pay over and above SIL a contribution towards the provision of affordable housing? Or is it a function of the part of SIL to go towards affordable housing? Okay, what's being said by Mr. Hunter is they're going to get back to us on that because there's a nuance about what you can collect from SIL. So I think it's a very important, that is a very important question because it's affecting how we actually put this policy together. That it does contribute, absolutely. Councillor Leake.
I think I agree that the percentage should be the same, whether it's in the Basingstoke or Tadley, or whether it's outside those areas. My personal preference would be that for development sites outside Basingstoke, the number should be 10, not 3, for the reason I gave earlier, that for many areas we can provide additional affordable housing through the exception sites. But what I particularly want is for the Cabinet, before it determines its recommendation to Council, that it is satisfied that the SIL to be collected, together with the funds which they realistically believe can be raised from all these other sources, which have never seemed to produce anything previously, will fulfill the financial requirements for all the infrastructure that we want. I think we just have to emphasize the infrastructure deficiency that we have suffered and we've all talked about and we seem to forget most of the time. Thank you very much.
Councillor Gardner, very briefly.
It is very brief. Councillor Leeks says that with small developments of 10, we can always put affordable housing in as exception sites. He's absolutely right. We can, but there's no guarantee that we will. It is totally dependent on sites being found for these exceptions. So we've got to be very careful with that.
Thank you. Councillor Mr. Cubitt.
Thank you. In Italy, you have 4 sets of accounts. You have invariably a set of accounts for the bank manager. You have a set of accounts for the taxman. You have a set of accounts for the wife. And invariably you have a set of accounts for the lover. And my point is that the viability is such a movable feast that we'll probably get the 5th set of accounts, the accounts for the council, that demonstrates that the developer is bleeding cash and isn't making any profit, and he's doing it because he's a philanthropist and he doesn't really want to build on greenfields. He's been compelled to operate in a capitalist environment, but he can't make any profit.
Thank you for the comment. I read in the draft policy that the applicant is required to submit an open book viability assessment. Could I ask the officers what they understand by that? Just to follow on from your point.
Certainly, I'm no surveying expert in terms of viability assessments, but it would set out all the various costs involved in purchasing a site, the build costs, the requirement for affordable housing, and how that would impact upon the overall profit levels, and that should be explained clearly. What we've done in the past when we've received these is to check them with an external source or with the property services team to make sure they're valid and they're not trying to pull the wool over the local planning authority's eyes.
Thank you for that, but I do understand the point you made, Mrs. Cubitt. It's very valid. They have a 6th one in France. It's called a briefcase under the table. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I've been waiting for this debate for most of this whole process, really, because for me, if I'm being honest, this is the most important policy of the lot for me, personally. So from a professional, from a personal, from a political perspective, and I can bring all of that to the table. If we don't get this right, my view is that realistically this is probably the most important policy to many of the residents I represent. And if we don't get it right, I think we're letting them down terribly. So my problem at the moment is that I genuinely have looked at the best practice that's out there. I've gone and looked at knowing what happens in the industry. And I love the viability argument, because to be honest with you, what this policy is a negotiating tool. That's exactly what this policy is. It is to arm our officers to be able to negotiate with developers on the land that they seek to bring forward for development. And they will play their viability games, because they will play their game of chess with us as they move through this policy to achieve what is their goal at the end of it. Now, that might well include affordable housing, but it is that art of negotiation and the art of what is written, interpreted by lawyers and brought back, and how they cook the figures in different ways. I don't mean that negatively. I mean genuinely how they look at the build costs and shape them. They'll take a bit off of here and they'll add a bit there and we'll rework this bit. Oh, and if I did that, then I can give you this. And if I didn't do that, then I can give you that. That's the reality of the development industry. So in the context of this, and I see it day in, day out, if we don't get the tightness of policy in a way that gives us security to deliver what we genuinely want, then we have an issue. So the very starting point for me with this is that the percentage bit is really important. I think we can be more aspirational than we should be. And other authorities around the country are being, because they have similar issues to us. I mean, the SMART gives us a picture, and we can't ignore that, and we'd be foolish to try to ignore that in any way. So I think the SMART gives us a picture that we must try to deliver in policy for, and balance that with the developers' need to make a profit. Because the MPPF tells you that you've got to do that. So that's your real balance. The bit that falls out of that, for us, is obviously the SIL argument. And I think the issue with the SIL bit, for me, is that you wind up tying your hands, one hand behind your back, to try and deliver your affordable housing. Well, you've got your SIL, in a sense, being flexed in no real terms, really, because it's set. You set your SIL. And the bit that's left flexible is the affordable housing. It is the bit that winds up losing out, if you say, in a sense. The issue for the developers are, that's why I disagree with this, because, that to me is not a true picture. I know it isn't. I genuinely believe I know it isn't. So from that point of view, how do we then approach this policy? I can't support this. And I couldn't support a local plan that had it in it, to be honest with you. I really couldn't. So that's why the Labour group have done what we've done, and why we've tried to think about this in the way we have, why we're fighting for socially rented housing in the way we are, and why I think policy examples like Oxford and Exeter, other ones like West Oxfordshire, there's some really good examples of authorities of all political colours that have grappled with this issue and come out with far better policies than we have got in front of us tonight. And I know we've got a deadline, and I know you're trying to get there across the finishing line. I do appreciate that. But we can do much better than this, and particularly for the residents that, for residents I represent, and I'm sure you would do as well. So I would say, in terms of comments to the Cabinet member on this policy, one, we've got to understand what it actually does, what it's there for. Yes, it's there to sit in a suite of policies in our document, but it's also a negotiating tool that we need to have as strong as we have with the developers. In terms of the district value, and I love this about the viability bit, because I've had experience of district valuers that have been grossly incompetent at their jobs and have wound up leading councils holding the in appeals. How you go about your viability and your assessment of open book accounting is really key. Holding those developers' feet to the fire really does take some skill, and it takes some real work. And I think that's a really important point. So the tightness of that whole section is important. And in terms of the tenure split, about it being straightforward, for me it's a starting point. Start here and work your way down. Start because we know we need socially rented housing, and we know we need it to be affordably socially rented housing. It's all right talking about Di saying that in some areas affordable rent was more cheap than social rent. What she was actually telling us in the report was most of our housing register can't afford the social rent or affordable rent product at the moment. Now, unless we generate some kind of Basingstoke-based product that we can generate with developers and with our social registered social landlords, we generate something that meets that need and find a way of funding it through all this system, through all this process, then in a sense the policy becomes almost meaningless, because it's almost the aside. We lose the battle from the outset. So we have to start with the bar where it needs to be. So for me, it's an aspirational housing target, and it's an aspirational, the whole thing about 50%, that's really important, I think. 40%, the whole debate around 70-30, it needs to be 70 socially rented. So for me, in terms of affordable housing, that would be the direction of travel I would go in. And finally, Chair, just to comment very briefly in terms of, the evidence base for all of this, there are other authorities out there that have actually seen the delivery in terms of affordable housing on sites that have grant and sites that do not have grant. And that is something in a distinction that we're not making in this, and we're not understanding necessarily. Where you have grant, development has actually been able to have been delivered at quite good aspirational rates of 50%. Where you don't have grant, yes, there are issues, so you might come down to 40 or 35. but it's a negotiation. You don't start out thinking, here's the limit, and then we'll go up from here, because the developer will never go up. So I guess for me at the moment, Chair, I can't support this as it's currently written, and it's a fundamental red line for me with the whole local plan.
Councillor Mr James.
My recommendation to Cabinet is scrap this policy CN1, because if you don't scrap it, the Labour group will not be supporting the local plan. We are actually, or the plan is proposing to build 748 units. Why are we building housing if we're building housing that people can't afford to live in? What's the point of that number being built? We've got a register with 7,000 people on, and we've been told by the SHMA that it's going to be increasing. The demand is growing, and it's going to be ever growing. We were told last night that we've got a transport assessment because of what we're building. We've got this plan, and we're going to build this massive amount of greenfield development. And the transport assessment said you're going to need a massive amount of money to mitigate because of the development. And the development that we're then going to be building is development that most people can't afford to live in and are not going to be able to afford to live in, and it isn't going to meet our housing need because the people on the register can only afford, we're being told, social rented. There are a few that can afford affordable, but predominantly it's because they can only afford social rented. We're also told within this plan and in the presentation last night that our site, Manydown, we're going to be proposing 30% affordable units on it. That's an absolute disgrace. And what we're told by an officer tonight is if we put 30% affordable, there will be those altruistic social landlords that will come forward and deliver 40 or maybe 45 or maybe even 50 or even higher, even 100% affordable units, and even particularly in relation to regeneration. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that, and they will not be doing that. We've got £23 million new home bonus for the next 6 years.
Is this a comment on the policy? If you say you can't support the policy, are you contributing to this policy?
Yeah.
Well, 23 million in the bank doesn't
No, it's not in the
contribute to this
bank.
policy.
We have 23...
Whatever, Councillor Mrs James, its economics aren't reflected in this policy by numbers.
No, they're not. It's
So
about
where would you
how
like
we
your comment to be inserted?
This is in relation to how we achieve a higher affordable unit. You're saying that it's 30. I think we can be much more aspirational than that. I think we've got a housing crisis in Basingstoke, an absolute housing crisis. I mean, we're being told that this council is going to be delivering 748 units. And the percentage of that now is going to be a model that most people in the borough can't afford. People will tolerate delivery of housing if you're saying that you're going to actually build housing that they can live in. If we're actually going to be building housing now that people can't live in, why are we doing it? Is it then to mitigate for the transport assessment that we told last night that we have to do? Is that why we're building the housing now?
Where would you like this put into the policy, Councillor James?
I'd like to put it on just underneath the policy, if you could, just outside of the box. In relation to... Yeah.
Councillors, please. Everything you say, please, through the chair.
Thank you. I am going through the...
I'm trying to get comments on the policy wording itself. That's how I started this part of the meeting. Councillor Mrs Cubitt, thank you. Don't make complaints to me. You can make complaints to the Chief Executive if you'd like. Councillor Mrs James. Councillor Mrs James.
Thank you.
We're focusing on the policy.
I'd like to also ask the Cabinet to look at Oxford's local plan that was adopted in February. It's an exceptionally good local plan. It really is exceptional. And the way it's laid out and what we should be having in relation to our affordable housing policy is good practice, and we should be looking at that. This is a high demand area. We've got a really high demand for housing need. And at the moment we're being told by officers we're only going to deliver 91 units over 4 years. So it is essential that we get this policy right. We need to as well, in this policy, I would like to see a cascade approach that is actually in the policy. Other authorities have included it in the box, and I want to see that in the box as part of the policy. I think that this policy is exceptionally disappointing, and I will not be supporting it.
Councillor Gary Watts.
Thank you, Chair. Also, I won't be supporting the 30% figure within the town. I think we're pulling up the drawbridge for the 7,000 on the waiting list. We had a presentation a couple of weeks ago where we said we needed a minimum of 300 homes to house those people a year. I mean, this 30% is not going to deliver 300 homes. I mean, we're taking a snapshot in time with this particular figure. I mean, I think we should aim high with the seal and high with affordability as well. I mean, we've got a lot of scope as well. We own a lot of the land that's coming forward. The county own a lot of land as well. And we can get good returns if we're flexible with our land prices. I mean, like other authorities have given up their land and for homes to be built on, and they get a return through the rent. They get better return than the 4.6% we would be getting on our Costa Coffee investment. So, you know, and it's morally correct as well, unlike our decision on Costa Coffee. And there's ever different sources as well of funding which we can also use. I mean, Councillor James is quite right. We could use the new home bonus money for infrastructure. I mean, but currently we're going to put 20% to support a revenue budget, 40% for major infrastructures. Yes, could cover things in this local plan, but we're going to have 40% for a capital bidding process for what I can see for local councillors. That is not strategic. That 40% should be put in to the major capital budgets for infrastructure improvements. I mean, I know this is happening because I was sat on the MAP or committee that looked at it, new homes bonus, and I disagreed with it. As for the 3 homes or 5 homes, I would like to see more structure around that. I mean, I think 3 homes is quite narrow. I quite agree with Councillor Mitchell. We should have some sort of structure, 5, 1 or something like that. But going forward, I just can't support this 30%. It's a step backwards, and I urge the committee to at least aim high. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Shaw.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think, you know, this policy is quite sort of perilous, really, and one of the things I'm rather conscious of is that, you know, the way things are shaping up at the moment, when we get to the full council or later in the month, you know, it looks increasingly likely that the local plan might actually get voted down. And, you know, that would be really quite serious in its implications. And I think that the administration on this policy and on a number of other policies needs to work a bit harder to try and avoid that eventuality. In terms of the specifics of the policy and related issues, I'm dissatisfied with the viability methodology, and particularly the way in which it sort of takes the underlying land value as a given and a set figure. Because, you know, the implication of that approach is that you know, landowners, you know, are in some way entitled to a particular figure that is, you know, judged to be, you know, the right figure, and there is no scope for sort of variation in that. And, you know, I think that rather sort of contradicts the whole concept of sort of supply and demand and fluctuation in value and so on. So I disagree with the, you know, with that element of the viability methodology in particular. I listened very carefully to what Councillor Golding said, and I'm somewhat confused, to be honest, because you know, the argument that he was advancing was, well, look, actually, if you look at the reality of the sites that are down to be allocated, they will, in practice, even on Dragon's methodology, be viable. And in counterpoint to that, officers referred to the sort of tables, and I think that at the moment is sort of unresolved, and I'd like that to be teased out, so that we sort of have a better understanding of what Councillor Golding was putting forward, because I think that it had a lot to commend it. There should certainly be some degree of sort of financial modelling ahead of the cabinet meeting that says, here is how the thing shapes up overall, and as it stands at the moment, you have an affordable housing requirement, 40% say, an aspiration, infrastructure delivery costs of X, a target of a certain level of SIL, and that can all be achieved, or it can't all be achieved, and here are the sort of the variations where you might insist on the 40%, but this would be the implication of it. And I think that really Cabinet needs to have that kind of modelling in place in order to be able to make an informed decision. But pending that, I am in favour of the figure of 3 being the threshold for the affordable housing requirement, and I agree with the officers in that regard. And again, at this stage of proceedings, I am in favour of the 40% figure being applied also.
Councillor Keith Watts. And Councillor Golding, if you'd like to come up to the table after Councillor Keith Watts, you wish to speak.
Chairman, until last night I was of the opinion that we must at all costs get a local plan this time round, and I was prepared to compromise some of my views in order to see that happen. I'm not at all sure, after seeing the pathetic response on traffic analysis. As far as this is concerned, like others, this is the most important part of the new plan for me, and I'm encouraged by the tone from Councillor Golding all the way down to me. We seem to be in favour of getting affordable homes, and the disagreements between us is what is going to be the most effective way of getting them, taking account also of the SIL. I think that's the case. Well, when Councillor Golding said we should forget this barrier and have 40% across the piece, I was happy with that. I think probably it's more to the point that it's such a crude boundary. I mean, does it really mean that we cross a road somewhere in Winklebury and you get an extra 10% affordable housing? So I think that we need to have some way of writing in the flexibility. 40% is our policy, but we need to look at what effect it's going to have on SIL in particular cases, not because of what the postcode is. So fundamentally, though, I support Councillor Golding on that. I'm happy with the starting at 3 while adopting Councillor Mitchell's rules that we have a table rather than percentages, so that we know exactly what it means if there's 5 houses and it's not half a house here and half a house not. It would be a new tenure, wouldn't it, I suppose, if my house was half affordable and half rather expensive. So I'm sticking to the principle that this is really serious, that we get a local plan, although that's not really motivating me at the moment. I'm assured by the general tone that we are trying to do what's best for affordable housing. I go for the 40%. I go for starting as low as possible. And I'm afraid to say, perhaps a little bit out of character, I think I want to trust the officer's judgment on the best way to implement that. So I won't say I'll vote against the plan if this is in there, but I'll probably vote against the plan if we haven't got a better transport strategy.
Thank you. My comments are very short. I concur with many of the comments around the table at 40% across the board. I don't think we need the differential. Personally, I would go for the 5 because I like maths to be simple more than anything else, provided that anything below that, and the officers have already acknowledged it, they go back and say that there's a contribution from a developer at anything below that threshold, there's a way of recovering contributions towards affordable housing. I'm not going to get into the details of how it's calculated, whether it comes out of SIL or a separate pot of gold, but I think that's got to be considered. That's about it. I've got the same, how can I put it, uncertainties about the viability calculations, but I did hear from Mark that it is used by other councils. They have put that general methodology into their plans, and it has been accepted by the inspectors. Anything else that is put forward has to have that kind of criteria, as far as I understand, for us to be able to prove that this viability works and is accepted by the inspectors. It's fine, we can rubbish anything, but if we're looking at best practice. That's the expression I've always used in industry. That's as far as I'll go. Councillor Golding.
Just to clarify what I was saying, if officers wouldn't mind going back to the slide with all the vertical columns in it. This is going to be slightly tricky without a pointer, but I will do my best. Edge. Yeah, that one, excellent. Right. Now, just to show, I will have difficulty reading some of the numbers. There are 2 horizontal lines there. The lower horizontal line is set at a land value of 1 million per hectare. The higher one is set at 1.3 million. And I presume the right-hand column, thank you, I presume the right-hand column has got 40% underneath it. And that quite clearly shows that at 1 million per hectare land value, there is no headroom for SIL or anything at 40%. But the evidence from Three Dragons was that for the large sites around Basingstoke, the correct land value is not that 1 million. It's the line that isn't really there at 400,000, i.e. the second little line up. And if you look at the second little line up, there is a considerable headroom at 40%. In fact, the headroom at 40% over 400,000 is bigger than the headroom at 30% above 1 million. So they've said for the 30% above 1 million, when the land value is 1 million, is acceptable, but the headroom above the 400,000 is even bigger at 40%. And the evidence clearly was that for most of our land, the relevant value is 400,000, not the million. That was the simple point I was making. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Leap, you really have finished, but it's
a question.
Excuse me?
I'd like a question in the light of the conversation, the statement by Councillor Golding. What I really want to establish is the largest site is Manydown. Does the agreement with the freeholder set the minimum price at which the land could be sold? Because,
we wouldn't. No. I'm advised that the council, the officers, do not have that information.
Other officers will.
May I say that it is relevant because it's all very well saying that we will sell it at a lower price, but if in that agreement it says the freeholder has the right, and I don't know whether he does or he doesn't, it's a question I'm genuinely asking, the freeholder has the right to influence the level at which they will sell, then that is a major factor, and we're talking about a site on which we're going to build 50% of our requirement.
So, I'll ask the director, is that, can we take that question back and try and...
It's a landowner question, we can take it. I can ask the landowner to, or the officers in property services to pick it up or and respond to you.
Only if other members agree that it is relevant, but I do believe it is a relevant question to ask at this stage.
My personal opinion is, does that affect this policy? The policy is the policy. This is a particular site, and I'm assuming from the officers that each site will be examined for its viability. Yes, it will be viability on any particular site.
The case studies which we went through last night, which picked up particularly, for instance, site of 3,000, was looked at from a viability perspective, so that you could see what likely SIL would be achieved at the £400,000 value. So they've been looked at in a strategic sense, if you like, from that basis. I think anything that's to do with the landowner's specific issues is more of a landowning question, and not for us.
I'm going to ask Karen to run through on this particular version of CN1, capture the comments that were made around the table.
Right. They're not so much comments, but what I'm going to push you on is there were different views on different things around the table. So the first thing I heard from several of you was that I think there was general consensus that it should be the same percentage across all areas of the borough. No one seemed to favour the split between rural, town, edge of town.
Yep.
Yes? So that's the first comment we'll pass on. Then there was some discussion around the percentage. I didn't hear anyone support the current proposal of 30% to apply across the borough. I heard several talk about 40, and I heard some talk about being more aspirational than 40. So,
Members, who would favour the 40%?
3, 4, 5, and then again.
And would we?
More aspirational is your next.
Who'd look for another percentage? No, we need a number. 50%.
No.
Who would be in favour of 50%?
3 for 50.
3 for 50.
5 for 40.
I don't think there was another number mentioned. No, it doesn't work like that. It's not.
But you have to have a clear.
Who votes against 50%? 40%. Who's voting against 40%? No, they're not voting against it.
So you're abstaining. So.
Okay, understood.
I made my position quite clear that until we know the money coming from the SIL, I'm not prepared to say one way or the other.
That's fine. So abstaining. That's fine.
So if I make the comment that there were mixed views, but overall more people favoured the 40% than didn't. And no one favoured 30.
There was also 5 members that said we should be more aspirational.
So how about a comment along the lines of there was mixed views, no one favoured the 30%, several favoured a more aspirational target, for example 50%, but overall the majority, on balance, the majority favoured 40%.
Yes.
Okay? I hope you've got that, Bernie. Right, the next issue was, I think there was a general wish that that you wanted the wording checked because you wanted to make sure that whatever figure you put in, it didn't preclude over-delivery. You just wanted officers to check that they at least, yes? Then there was split again on the 3, on the 5, or on the 10. So I heard a couple for 3, I heard a couple for 5, and I heard a couple for 10. Over to you, Chair.
Who supports 3 as the minimum number?
We can't conduct the vote that way, you know. We'll have to have a single transferable vote election if we're really going to sort of have 3 options and decide between those. It'll be.
We're trying to come to a general feeling of the comments that
yeah,
are going to go
so
forward to the cabinet.
I don't actually think that taking a vote, with three different number options actually achieves the desired aims of. Well, yeah, but the portfolio holder heard the debate. Wow, it's completely ludicrous, to be perfectly.
Can I, as a member of the Electoral Reform Society, I think the appropriate way to do this is called a Dutch auction.
What numbers? Who favours 10? Thank you. Who favours 5? Majority favours 5. Thank you, members.
Then I moved on to, on that basis, though there was, I think, more than one person raised a concern about the percentage for the lower number, and that you thought maybe a table would be better where you actually gave exact numbers rather than percentage for that, for under 20, I think it was. Yeah? Okay. And then there were two versions of the 70-30 split that I picked up. There's the officer's proposal, which is that you retain it at 70% rented and 30% intermediate, with an explanation in the supporting text that each case would be considered on its own merits as to what was affordable rent and what was social rent. Or then there was the other proposal put forward, which was a 70-30 split, but that should be 70% social rent, I think I'm right in saying, with the intermediate being the 30%.
You heard the first one, you heard the second one. Who supports the first? Okay, I'll repeat it again. Is that it's the split of affordable homes will be 70% rented. It is as per the writing in here, and 30% intermediate products. It's a jargon phrase, but alternatively, the second one is 70% social rented with 30% intermediate products. That's the second one. Everybody clear? First one. First one, that's 70% rented with 30% intermediate products.
6.
The second one, 70% social rented with 30% intermediate products.
So that was a split.
Thank you. Split vote. That will be transmitted to the cabinet.
Your casting vote, Chair?
I voted in the first place. Inappropriate. Just trying to get a feel from the committee, because this is all we've been asked to do in the papers. If you go right back to the beginning, it's the comments to be forwarded to the cabinet. Then the cabinet.
Can I just commend you for actually doing the constitution, because that's a very important point.
Then I think I picked up, moving swiftly on. Then I think I picked up that there was a wish for us to perhaps look in the supporting text about something that suggested clustering was not what we were looking for, that more even distribution of housing across the sites, but recognising that would be picked up in individual site policies again. Agreed. Sorry, I'm going as fast as I can. Cabinet must be satisfied that still and other funding sources. Oh, you wanted a general statement, I think, to Cabinet that they must be satisfied that SIL and the other between SIL and the other funding sources and the percentage of affordable housing, that the infrastructure itself wouldn't be squeezed, because infrastructure you still believe is quite important. Very important.
I think the words are material considerations. Whether it's directly materials, it's a planning expression. I think if I turn to officers, it's material in the planning process. I think what the feeling of most of us, most members, is if you don't get the infrastructure, you don't get the housing. That's been expressed on many occasions because we exist within an environment where we haven't got the infrastructure when they've been promised in the past under a different regime. I don't know if that's the will of the committee. is along similar lines to what you said. I know it's a toughie to put in, but I'm going on the will of members. Yes, Councillor Shaw.
I think the issue, Chair, is that the Cabinet needs to have a financial model in front of it that enables it to know, what the plan is likely to achieve in terms of infrastructure, affordable housing, and the tenure split, and then the Cabinet can put forward its position on, this is the balance that we draw, this is what we regard as acceptable, appropriate, and so on.
I think I'll go back to the comment made by Mr. Hunter when he said, when we started in the IDP, we're going to get a much better feel for that anyway. So it's a matter of process now. As we roll along, I think that's what will end up going to the Cabinet. Okay, thank you very much. Now, another policy has been presented to us this evening. Now, I said we had to do this in a linear fashion. That's the only way we can do it. Can we quickly go through that? And I'm going to ask whether the I was thinking of the alternative draft policy CN1. I've got to take this next. It was given to us tonight by the Labour Group. No, I had to take this one first. This is the one presented by officers. I'm going to give us about 2 minutes quickly to refresh ourselves. The Labour Group have a head start on this one. And see whether it is the view of the committee, whether we address this. First of all, I want to know, do you want to go through this one? No, we have not rejected it. We have to consider it. This was the alternative from the Labour Group. I had to address the officers. Yes. Portfolio holder would like a word.
Can I say what my understanding is? The key parts of CN1 as drafted by Councillor Harvey are socially rented and 50%. The rest is, as I understand it, barring one or two sentences, is bringing in some of the supporting texts into the policy and trying to put it in a logical order. And I want to look at that carefully. I don't think it would be, may I respectfully suggest, a good idea to perhaps engage in a line-by-line analysis now, or to reject it out of hand just because of a difference of view on 50% or socially rented. I'd like to look at it carefully, and I'm in the process of doing so, and I'll look at it with the officers. So I'm not encouraging you to focus on it any further.
Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Accepting what the portfolio holder has just said, I mean, just to pick out very quickly for the purposes of the minutes, if you're able to, the couple of extra points, that the element of the cascade, the element of how you deal with viability is an incredibly important point to us, and that is why it is set out in this proposal in the way that it is. And the point about moving through the cascade to achieve the various socially rented, affordable rented, right the way down to financial contribution. Other authorities do this in this way. It is a well-recognised best practice approach. And, for example, Oxford and Lambeth and all the other ones we've mentioned are relevant to that. The other point to bear in mind, and I think it is important for the portfolio holder to consider, is having a definition of affordable housing that relates to Basingstoke. It has proved very, very useful in policy terms in other authority areas where their plans have been adopted, where they actually define the affordable housing in the context of what developers can bring forward that doesn't always fit the model precisely, but may well fit a definition. For example, as we've said here, meets the needs of households whose incomes are not enough to allow them to buy or rent decent or appropriate housing in the borough. It's that kind of generation of policy that we're looking for that is enabling. Now, the London Mayor, London authorities, other authorities have done this. Exeter, I can go on for all of this to all of them, but the point is made nonetheless in terms of best practice in approach to affordable housing. The other points about viability that I would just suggest as well, finally, is the point about where the decision rests. And I think the inclusion of members in that role, and that is important, that if you're going to vary this, that the democratic oversight of that variation is given some sort of expression. Now, that should come through DC. If you're going to vary something, DC is the arbiter on planning, and that needs to be fed in. Members need to know cross-party about that, I think, in terms of where their particular issues are affecting their wards. And finally, Chair, the £400,000 point, I think, is very interesting, because if you do look at that level, and this is the point we've been making, you could very easily achieve 50%. There is nothing that stops you achieving that in that context, set against those kinds of figures. That's my point about the land values and the approach, and the portfolio holder himself made the point, and I support it.
Thank you. Councillor Mitchell.
Thank you, Chairman. I welcome the portfolio holder's agreement that he's going to look at the cascade approach, because I totally agree with the cascade approach, although I personally would put it in the text rather than in the policy, because I'd like the opportunity to fiddle with it as I find out how well it works. And, if we haven't done it that way before, regardless of how many other people have done it. And I'd like the opportunity to think it through more carefully than I can in the context of seeing it this evening. I don't like the first paragraph where we seek to define affordable housing, because one of our problems is the government keeps changing the meaning of affordable housing. It's a jargon term used widely across the country, and I have to keep explaining it to people every time the government changes the definition, which they did quite recently. But for us to put a definition like this in, we'd have to think long and hard about the wording, because all the housing reports we get tell us what proportion of households in the borough can afford to buy a home. And it's completely untrue, because, of course, a very high proportion of households in the borough already have a home. It's the unhoused households who can't afford, and the hidden households, and those households who, because of the economy this week and last year, may be in more trouble and get their home repossessed. There's a set of people amongst households. But this bland statement that households with incomes are not enough, because it's written into all these reports, and I never bother to challenge it because it's in the mindset of people who write the reports. But it's complete nonsense, of course, because I couldn't afford to buy a home in the borough at the moment. No chance whatever suitable to my needs, but it just so happens I'm sitting in one. So I have no interest in buying a home. And two of my children are sitting in homes they own, and they're no interest. It's one of those things where you've got to look at the ones who are at the bottom of the ladder in some way, or get shifted onto the bottom of the ladder in some way. And these bland statements shouldn't be in long-lived policies. The other one, which I think is an issue here, which is where the viability case is accepted by the LPA, it's actually where the viability case is accepted by the officers. But if we want it to be the case that such a thing is automatically referred to committee, that's constitutional. It doesn't need to be in this policy. And we are careful not to put things in this policy or in any policy, which gives somebody out there a way of undermining the whole thing, because they undermine some nitpicky little thing. So I think we should step back, and I agree with the idea, and I'm very interested in putting the cascade in, but I'd rather have it in the text and have a chance to really think it through, how that would work in practice.
Thank you very much. Pardon? Yes. Right, I'm going to move on to the Royal Exception Policy, which is CN2, which you should all have a copy of. I'll ask Mark to present this.
Before I start, can I just make sure everyone's got a copy of the policy? CN2. We've got spares if you need it. You did. It was appended to the previous papers from yesterday, and it's in Appendix 2, but I've got additional copies if you want them. For those, it's on page 3 of the document that if any of you picked up the document from Andrew earlier, it's page 3 of that. Yeah.
It's on the back of the CN1 paper, exactly. The one that's got track changes in red. It's on the last page of that.
Just to introduce the paper very briefly, I'm hoping that members will be more happier with this paper. Fingers crossed. I've got my fingers crossed. That members will be familiar with this policy, as it seeks to permit rural exception sites with an element of market housing to subsidise that, if that's a particular issue in terms of viability. Again, that word. The policy differs from a previous version that members will have seen in the past. I think members were generally happy with the previous version, but this one provides more flexibility. In the past, the policy only permitted up to a maximum of 20% market housing, but this policy suggests that...
Sorry, I'm still not clear which thing we're looking at. Are we looking at rural
CN2.
On the back.
Effectively, it's a permissive policy that allows rural exception sites with an element of market homes to subsidise that where there's a viability issue. The only proviso is that the affordable housing should form the majority of the homes to be provided on a site. Members should be familiar with the policy because it's been discussed a number of times. I think in general, councillors were content with the way it was going.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor Leake.
Thank you. I support this, but I just want to ask one question. The fourth bullet point, the development will be integrated into the existing community. I'm not sure you can integrate a development into a community, and I'm not sure that that's what would necessarily be possible, because generally these sites would be exception sites at the edge of settlements, because by definition we don't have spare land in the middle of villages. So you might wish to say, where possible, the development should be integrated into the existing community, but I think if we have it will be, we won't get any sites at all.
Councillor Mitchell?
I was simply going to agree with Councillor Leake that I think the language is wrong anyway, because you can't incorporate a development into a community. And I've got rural exception sites in my ward coming forward, one of which actually happens to be in the middle of the village, but it's very unusual and unlikely. What you might want to think about is that the site relates well to the existing settlement, which is what we're always looking for, not always possible. Where possible, the site should relate well to the existing community. But we don't want to exclude ourselves from having them just because we can't find a site that happens to be separated by a strip, and is up a small road, up another road or something. Because there's a lot of people out there who don't think and knee-jerk react to these things and react against them, and that sort of thing gets picked up by these objectionable people who don't like people living in affordable homes, which gets up my goat more than I can say.
Thank you, Councillor Mitchell. Anybody else? Councillor Gardner, followed by Councillor Shaw.
I think there's some confusion here about the meaning of community, because you can have a development on the edge of a village which is still part of the community. What we don't want is a development which is separated from the existing community and becomes a separate community. It needs to be part of the environment in which it's set.
And that, what you're saying is, should that go into the policy?
As I read the policy at the moment, I'll be perfectly happy with it.
Thank you. Absolutely, Councillor Mitchell.
Just very briefly, and I don't think it needs to change the wording here, but in my view, a proportion of market housing is a good idea. And I very much welcome that change of national policy, because in a sense that's a pepper potting sort of thing that we always ask for in developments that have a share of affordable homes. You don't want them ghettoized, and you don't want these things to be ever regarded by people as another ghetto that somebody's building. And by having market housing, you stop that right from the outset.
Councillor Shaw.
I've got a problem with the first sentence of the final paragraph of the sort of policy itself, because it's rather clunkily worded, and it doesn't actually, I don't think, make clear, that we're only allowing the market housing when that is necessary for the viability. And I don't, the existing wording doesn't actually get that sort of fundamental point across.
That is accepted by the officers. They will amend it as required. Is everybody, bearing in mind those last couple of comments, Councillor Mrs. Tucker?
I just want to say generally, in my patch, I have 3 of these exception sites, and I'm absolutely delighted to still have the policy.
Thank you for that. Is the committee minded with those comments we've had this evening? It's been accepted by the officers that we've put this one forward. Well, they're going to examine them and it will then be forwarded to Cabinet. Yep. Thank you very much. I'm going to call about a 6-minute comfort break, and then we're going to tackle the IDP. Okay, members, let's make a start. IDP being presented by Mark Lambert, and he'll present the paper. We're starting off on this one on page 194 of 269.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mrs. Cubitt. The IDP has been developed to support the emerging local plan, and it sets out the detailed infrastructure requirements to support development up to 2029. Really, the emphasis of the IDP is on the first 5 years of the plan, and we recognise that the IDP will be updated in time as projects are completed and new requirements come to light. It's been worked up with key service providers in the borough, so that's people like the police, the emergency services, Hampshire County Council's Education Authority, officers in the council, and officers at the county council. What the IDP is, it's effectively in two sections. You've got the text of the document, which is on pages 194 to 262, and this really summarises each form of infrastructure, and it sets out which organisations are involved, what strategies are in place, what's proposed, and what additional, what else may be required to support development in going forward. The second part of the IDP is the schedule, and that's the A3 coloured document that's now in front of you. This updates and replaces slightly the version that was in the committee papers. What this does, it breaks down each form of infrastructure into specific areas, and then it sets these out into strategic infrastructure and more localised infrastructure, which is linked to particular sites. For each type, there's reference to the timescales for its delivery, which sites it's connected to, indicative costings, any funding that we've got identified to date, and the shortfall in funding that's come to light. It goes on to provide recognition that some infrastructure is necessary to support development, and some infrastructure is desirable to support development, and there's a specific definition of those terms in paragraph 5.21 on page 207 of the report. The key point to note in terms of the schedule is that it's come from many sources, and officers have tried to coordinate all those into one document. On this basis, I would ask members to note that whilst officers may have knowledge on certain of the schemes, we may not have detailed knowledge on every single scheme because it's come from various sources. If there's particular projects in there that are referred to that we can't respond to at this point in time, perhaps we can come back to that outside of the meeting via you, Chair. Just a couple of other things to note. It's not a policy document. It will need to be updated from time to time as things change, but it will play an important role in SIL setting in going forwards, because this totals up the amount of infrastructure required and its relative cost. I also wanted to flag up that the IDP will be consulted upon as part of the consultation on alongside the pre-submission local plan.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to read, going back to the beginning of this, the papers and the documents that we're considering, and this applies to this document as well. The committee are requested to consider the key component parts of the draft local plan, this was one of them, and make comments on its contents to help inform the document's development. That everything we're looking at is draft, yes? So, and to inform the decision of Cabinet on the 22nd of July. That's the aim of what we're trying to do here. See if we can go through this by 10 o'clock. I'll remind you of standing orders at 9:30. If it's referring to particular sites, don't forget that this is a strategic overview of what's happening. We'll have a chance to visit the particular sites on the 15th and 16th. Just to make that point. We don't want to drill down too deeply site by site. Right, I'm going to go around the table on this one, and I'm going to start with Councillor Keith Watts. This is your chance to do it.
Oh, well, I feel notably unprepared since I wanted to see the detail here. I think probably with the last infrastructures review plan, I made my comments in writing after the meeting, and if I can ask for that right again, please.
What's the is there a time element on this? Because this has to go before Cabinet on the 22nd of July.
I mean, obviously, if there are any written comments on very specific things, if they're copied to us and the portfolio holder, they're obviously your individual comments rather than comments of the committee. But if there's anything that needs sorting out, then we're more than happy to look at those.
Councillor Mrs. Cubitt, we are going round the table. This is not a separate meeting that you're going to be holding with anybody else. Councillor Shaw.
Councillor has conversations with each other, and every time I mention it, you pick on me, and I feel that you are victimising me at the moment, and that is why I have a problem with your chairmanship.
Fine, have the problem. But I have also commented on other councillors who have started up separate conversations. I'm sorry if I notice you. I pick everybody up.
Councillor Mitchell and Councillor Tucker have had various into conversations. You haven't commented on that. You haven't commented on a number of things. If you've got a problem with me, I suggest as chairman you ought to say that you have a problem with me, and then maybe we can deal with it some other format.
Thank you for the advice. Councillor Shaw.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mixture of sort of questions and comments. 17.8 of the officer report refers to Basingstoke College of Technology and notes that at current levels of growth, spare capacity at the college will last between 3 or 4 years. And my question on that is, what is the council's policy response to that issue? Moving on to comments, 24.8 and 24.16 refer to sports halls, and there's a little bit of history on sports halls because a number of years ago the council had in its capital programme capital provision for what were called sports barns in 2 different locations in the borough, and there was an issue, and one of the issues was that the council, although it had that capital provision, it didn't actually have the revenue to actually run those kind of facilities. And I just, make that reference because I think we need to be very careful, when we're sort of talking about specifics in terms of sports halls or whatever, that we are actually going to be able to deliver these in practical terms as well as sort of obtain funding for them. 24.15 refers to swimming pools, and there's reference to the options appraisal for swimming provision, and I'd welcome any update that officers have on the progress of that options appraisal and any implications for the local plan. The 24.35 says dependent on strategic site allocations, the council may lose 1 golf course. Well, as I understand it, the golf course is in one of the sites that is going to be allocated, so therefore on that basis it seems a certainty that the council would, the area would lose a golf course. So I suggest that we need to change the wording of that particular section. And 25.13 refers to the issue of sort of green space provision, and that particular section requires rewording because, as I've said in relation to another section of the local plan itself, it doesn't really address the issue of the fact that in some areas we have under provision of green space, and therefore we actually need to provide physical green space to address that under provision, and certainly not to make that under provision worse still, which that particular wording risks occurring. And I think that oh yes, I was going to ask about in the actual sort of table which we have in colour copy here as well, there are these levels of priority, and there's necessary, desirable, and required. And I think we need to be very careful about our use of language, and I'm not sure about the differentiation between required and necessary in particular, and also about this the cut-off point between desirable and necessary as well. And I sort of particularly note that junction improvements, road widening, in other words, changing roundabouts, is all described as necessary, whereas cycle improvements, pedestrian and cycling links, are all described as desirable. Councillor Leek opposite has suggested that perhaps cycling links are not desirable. We'll have that argument on a separate occasion. But this goes to the heart of the issue, because I think it goes back to the point that I made at an earlier meeting, that there is not a level playing field between addressing traffic issues by physical changes to roads and the alternatives of addressing those same issues in terms of improved public transport, changing the way that people travel, and so on and so forth. And I take issue with road improvements being identified as necessary, whereas cycle improvements and others are purely regarded as desirable.
Mark?
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and go through each of your points. It may be that I can't answer all of them, but in terms of the first point about BCOTs, the council doesn't have a specific policy, but obviously if things come to light that BCOT require, increased provision, then obviously the council will work with BCOT to help to achieve that if it's necessary. The sports barns, I'm afraid I don't know enough about that to comment on, so I'll pass on that one if that's okay. In terms of the swimming pool appraisal updates, again, not something I'm that familiar with, but again, we can look into that and provide you with a response. The golf course reference on 24.35, agree that sentence should be deleted. And then finally, the last point I picked up was in terms of the necessary and desirable references in the table, and those are defined on page 207 of 269. So that's how we've interpreted those two definitions there.
Councillor.
I thank Mark for that reply, and I had noticed that was that definition of the distinction between desirable and necessary, but I think my underlying point still stands, and you didn't answer the question about the differentiation between required and necessary.
I don't think there are any requireds in there, and if they are, they shouldn't be there.
Certainly there was a required on the copy as it existed at the time of the report, but perhaps that has been changed in the version that we've just had in the last few minutes. I don't know.
Perhaps if you can identify it to me, I'll make sure that amendment's taken forward, please.
The A33 link to Cuffold Lane, Chinham Distributor Road is identified on the original version as required. Page 263 of 269. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Gary Watts.
Yeah, on the same lines, Councillor Shaw, cycling, pedestrian, desirable. We've got money actually allocated. I would like to see us have a strategy for these particular areas. I know Councillor James mentioned Oxford, but they've got an excellent cycling strategy. I know it's a totally different area, but we can aspire, and I think we should start looking at modal shifts and setting up a cycling pedestrian strategy. And where we say in here desirable improvements at the rail station and Overton rail station, I mean, desirable, I'd say that's necessary. So that's one statement. And I would like a cycling walking strategy, part of the overall, incorporating the overall strategy. And the funding, I mean, I notice there's lots of funding gaps here. I mean, there's 21 million for Kempshot Roundabout. There isn't even a figure here for Brighton Hill Roundabout. How we tapping into other sources? I mentioned the New Homes bonus, but have we looked at regional growth funds, local transport board? How are we tapping into all these different sort of avenues of money? Have we got a overlapping strategy to tap into all these?
I think we're happy to tap into any pot of money that's available, and we'll happily make a bid to do so. We've got 3 bids in at the moment for the local transport board for schemes in and around the town, and we'll continue to take advantage of any opportunities that come to light. Really, that's why we've got an other column in the schedule to identify where things may come to light in the future.
Councillor Mrs James?
First one I wanted to raise, really just also say it is so difficult within a couple of minutes just to be able to respond to this paper. I think, it's a critical paper. I haven't seen this. Have I seen this? Is it? Right, sorry, okay. Okay. I want to raise about infrastructure requirements, about, can you explain to me about improvements to existing swimming pool provision, the town centre, Aquadome, New Pools, Cranbourne / Queen Mary's? Can I just ask about the Cranbourne Queen Mary's?
Personally, I don't know enough about those particular projects, but it was a point that was raised by Councillor Shaw as well, I think. So I think we've said we'll come back to you on that point with a bit more detail when we get a chance to speak to colleagues.
Because I particularly have concerns about that, and so I do want to know about that. I also want to raise about off-site, in relation to green infrastructure. Is this, on the first comment, it talks about off-site habitat creation. Is that mitigation that we said that we wouldn't have within the strategy? So whereas a site can't deliver, we're going to mitigate. Page. Doesn't say a page, does it?
When we pick up anything, can we please refer to the page or
There isn't a page on there.
or column? Because
Page. This is green infrastructure. The first comment.
The colour copy's not paginated.
Off-site habitat creation, restoration and management of mitigation residual development impacts that cannot be mitigated on-site, excluding... So there's money going to go forward for something that we can't deliver on-site. I thought we'd said that... I'm just concerned about that. I'd like to understand that a bit more, what that is. Sorry.
Yeah, we check that with the biodiversity officers. This is, I think, more to do with habitat creation rather than it is and restoration and management. So it may be specific to some sites. We'll just double check that with them. As Mark said at the start, this is an agglomeration of stuff that comes from all across the council. So we may not be specifically clear on each and every box in here. This is more to try and give you an overview of all the projects and the types of costs that we're going to see, but we can come back on that.
anything else, Councillor James?
In the actual document on page 204, you talk about site references in relation to the phasing. What happens, because a lot of those are in the pipeline and are in what happens in relation to that phasing on that page, and how does that then affect our 5-year housing land supply?
That table's just intended to reflect what's in the local plan. So when the local plan's taken forward, this table will replicate that. It's not taking account of which sites are in at the moment in terms of applications or appeals. It's just merely setting out how we would anticipate in a plan-led environment how we would expect sites to come forward.
Committee, standing orders. Initially, we'll try for 10 o'clock.
But in that phasing, for example, you're saying that Razors Farm, you know, or say Cufford Farm is going to be 2019, 20 to 23. If it comes forward beforehand, or it is coming forward, how does that affect this phasing? And then how does it affect our 5-year land supply if everything's going to come forward in the first part of the local plan?
I think that's a much wider question than related to the IDP. This is simply setting out in here, if these were the sites that we take forward, then the IDP is related on that. As you know, obviously, if sites come forward, receive a permission, then they move into the supply side and start to work towards our 5-year land supply. But this in here is simply for the basis of the IDP to relate it back to the local plan. And the phasing in those boxes is what is set out in the local plan. If it comes forward a year before that or whatever, then you would mitigate and bring forward the infrastructure in line with that.
The other one that I had to ask about is, and I've got to find it here somewhere. Cemetery, where's the cemetery?
Don't forget that we're looking for comments as well as
Yeah,
we can
cemeteries, new burial grounds is desirable. Is it desirable? I thought we was told it was necessary.
It's not necessarily desirable to support new development. That's when the infrastructure becomes necessary.
Anything else, Councillor Mr. James? Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Just to reiterate my colleague's points about the desirable and the necessary, I think it's a bit too arbitrary and it's a bit too simplistic in relation to this. I don't know whether we can do something about that, but I don't see that as being easy to work through such an important and complex document. And at least thank you for the officers putting it together, because I don't underestimate the amount of time and task that's gone into this. It's been a lot. Totally support what's been said so far. I note the amount of ticks we have in both the SIL and the other box. Again, just reinforcing the point that SIL ain't going to pay for anything regardless of what happens in other areas. So how in the world we're going to make some of this money up is going to be interesting to see. The issue I've got with some of this is, if I go and look at Kennel, and if I go and look at Kiln, if I go look at Razors and Cufford as they come through, if I look at their Section 106 agreements, or at least the heads of terms that are being negotiated as part of their Section 106 agreements, will I see the crossover between your colleagues on planning now, looking at those planning apps and this document, and the money that we're looking at to get out of those planning apps, relevant to this document for IDP? Would I see that crossover?
You should see that crossover because the colleagues that are responsible for scoping as part of the 106 process are the same colleagues that have contributed to this. So there should be that crossover there between what's happening on the ground with applications and what's in the IDP, at least in terms of the costings.
So I noticed Andrew shook his head in then two different ways then. Just forgive me, Mark. It was like, okay. Sorry, Andrew, do you want to...
The only thing I would say is these would be the ones that the scoped cost, so what you would expect to achieve, and specifically, I suppose, a particular Section 106 agreement may have been negotiated, so there may be differences in that sense, if that's what you're getting at.
I mean, for me then, that raises the interesting point. If we say that out of our list of sites, a good half a dozen of them are already coming through, they're looking at planning apps for significant levels of housing, obviously because we're talking about Razors and Cufford and Kennel and so on, they're big sites. So the problem I've got with this is it's a nice document, and it's telling us what our aspiration might well be for our IDP, But if it isn't in the 106, where does that then leave us? Because obviously we've lost those sites to the IDP, to the aspiration that's in this document. And if it isn't in the 106, they ain't going to cough up later, because they're going to cough up what the heads of terms are agreed on the planning apps now. So I guess that's my issue really, is the translation between reality that we're seeing and what you've. I mean, I know why you've done it, and it's really good. This is a good document. I appreciate it, but it's just this notion of where it leaves us.
Well, this is to support the local plan. I mean, if a planning application comes forward, it will have its own Section 106, and will be judged against. excuse me, judged against that. What this is doing is saying, if this site was to come forward, theoretically, this is what you would seek through Section 106. As I say, independently, they will be negotiated on specific sites, and this is just trying to give us a clear picture as to the type of funding that you might get and when you might get it.
So I guess, Chair, for the Cabinet to bear in mind that at the moment, with that level of application coming through on those particular sites, there is a very serious risk that we're not going to get what we want in our plan, but rather we're going to get the specifics of allowing that on the merits of the site by site by site, and the merits of their Section 106, if you like, set against the existing infrastructure position of the immediate area to which that site is relevant, not the strategic picture that Andrew and his team have quite rightly put together here, which is a very good document. The only thing just quickly to say is the relationship, I think, between some of the aspiration in this, and I know why it is, but if you go through some of these particular bullet points, the schools and so on, it's, for me, understanding the relationship to, for example, do we need a new school on site, or does that mean sticking classrooms on an existing school? If we talk about the sports facilities, or is that existing? It's just understanding that as well when we do look at the site selection, because for a site to be capable of delivering a primary school, or being close enough to see kids walk to the next primary school that may well benefit from the IDP, is an important consideration in allowing that site to go forward. And that's just one example, let alone all the others.
Yes, Andrew.
Just respond on that. Obviously, we take the advice of Hampshire on that. I think in this we've tried to identify where it's an expansion, a reserving of a site, or an actual on-site provision. But we're guided by Hampshire in that to some extent.
Yeah, and also, Chair, you're guided by what the developers will allow you to put on their site and negotiate with Hampshire outside of us.
I can identify with just about all the points you made, because I'm a governor of 2 schools locally as well. Yep. Councillor Cubitt.
Mark, if you just talk me through the costing of, on the second page of the A3, the A30 Kemp Shop roundabout road widening and junction improvements. Is that a typographical error, or is that a legitimate projected cost? Second page. It's called the A30 Kemp Shop roundabout, 21.1 million.
That was a figure that came out last night during the transport assessment when the consultants went through the different schemes and identified that that particular scheme amounted to 21 million.
My second question is, why is it that the mitigation proposed on the Binfield roundabout, which is the one where we've already had it identified as going to be the greatest problems, the largest widening, the greater flares, the largest number of additional transport, and that's only costing 2.1 million.
This particular Kemp Shop roundabout involved further road widening than the scheme at Binfields, so it was taking that, it was dualling the road to sectors.
2 junctions.
Could you explain to me why all the BAS 098 transport sections are to be confirmed and we haven't got any figures on them?
Yeah, I think from the stuff that came about last night, not all of the junctions yet were finished, if you remember. So the costings are directly related to those. So once we've had those final 6 junctions looked at, then we'll be able to populate the fields in the table.
Okay. Could you just very briefly explain to me what the pink means as opposed to the black? I didn't hear. The numbers, the words in the box. I understand what the pink means, as in the block colour, but the pink that's in the numbers.
It was just to identify where there was something added in since the one which we published in the papers.
That's what I assumed, right. Okay, on SUDS, has there been any evaluation of monies and costs that need to be spent in relation to SUDS? As I understood from the costs of that's a cost that's going to arise, and I don't think it's the same thing as the wastewater treatment or the wastewater treatment and water distribution. And I know that when we had the first water cycle study and the second water cycle study, one of the biggest issues outside of Basingstoke is the sustainable urban drainage systems that are going to be needed to be put into the developments in order to address potential exacerbation of flooding that already takes place.
Those are measures that the developer would have to take forward in terms of making the scheme acceptable, because they'd have to go through the SUDS approval board, which is now in place. So in terms of that's a development cost that they would pick up rather than an infrastructure cost that we would seek for them to do. They'll have to do that as part of their development anyway.
Just out of interest, do you know roughly, so for example, on a 900 dwelling site like 121, how much the SUDS would cost? Because I'd always been advised it was prohibitive. And since we've been having the conversation on affordable homes and viability, in that instance, it might be a very legitimate argument when we establish that the SUDS costs will be so great, and that is a facility that will be provided by the developer in addition to the roads, which Three Dragons referred to as being prohibitively expensive as well on a large greenfield site.
The officers indicate that they have got no idea of that. We'll try and find out and come back to the committee.
In terms of the secondary schools, could you explain to me, in terms of BAS 121, you've got a funding shortfall of 5.8 million. Now, theoretically, there's only 900 houses being built on that site. So I've just spotted Bramley's not spelt correctly either, and it's got an extra E. But why is that amount of money needs to be spent for a 900 house site?
It's because there's a shortfall of secondary places in that part of Basingstoke, and the county have identified a need for a reserve site for a secondary school. It's anticipated that through SIL we would be able to take contributions from across the borough, across the town, to fund that school.
But are you suggesting that there's going to be a school built there? Because it just suggests that it's an expansion of an existing local secondary school.
Sorry, that's my mistake there. There's not a secondary school on that particular site.
Why is the BAS 098 one 40 million?
The difference is there. That's one is dealing with expansion, and that one is dealing with provision. So it's a reserve site, which would, if you were building a new school, then you're talking about 40 million for a new secondary provision.
But I don't understand, because at the moment, on the planning for BAS 098, you're only looking at 3,000 houses. Would that result in just the 3,000 houses? Would that result in a brand new school at 40 million with 3,000 houses normally?
No, I think that was Mark's trying to make the point that this is a strategic document, so you're looking across the piece. So you would be dealing with the growth in pupils from the whole of the requirement, and then you've got to see where you would then seek to provide secondary provision. So it's where you could physically provide secondary provision to meet the needs of all of the 13,000 or whatever extra houses that you might have across the piece.
Do you not think it would be more informative to us as members when evaluating the costs of potential sites on the 15th that we look at the costs that are generated many down, not in terms of what will be built in 30 years' time, but actually what you're planning to put in the plan for the next 15, because that's not for the next 15, is it?
Maybe I didn't make myself clear. Across the piece, the likelihood is that there's a need for a provision of a secondary school within the next 15 years, so in the plan period, and that developments will have to contribute towards achieving that. And I think that that's what that's showing, is that is the site where you might be able to achieve it in terms of land. You know, it's available to do so. I mean, this has come from the county, so it's the county's view, not ours. We're just simply reflecting what they would say we might need over that plan period.
No, I understand that, but there's two ways of looking at this. This is, if I add up all the BAS 098s, then it's going to come out with a figure. I mean, that's presumably why we're doing all this. And that 40 million then would be an additional cost that will then, this is the way I, having spent 6 years as a councillor, have experience, is that we'll then be told that the costs for BAS 098 are prohibitive. That's the narrative. And so what I'm trying to understand, and it's a little bit like the questioning with Kempshot, is it that I am developing some form of mental illness, or is it that there's seriously some narrative which is that Kempshot's going to cost 21 million, Manydown's going to cost 40 million, and yet these significant mitigations that we've been promised in terms of will be required in the event of 900 houses being built in my ward, the costs are minimal and negligible in comparison to the numbers that are being ascribed or prescribed to BAS.
I don't think this is intended in any way to make one site look more favourable than another. It's simply saying that over the plan period there are these pieces of infrastructure that are going to be required, and because the majority of that will now be gathered through SIL, so a pooling method, that will help in terms of achieving that, so that you can, if you've got a school on one site, you've collected from all this point that members often make to us, that we're not thinking cumulatively, we don't pick everything up, and if we don't do it in one area, then we don't pay for the thing that's happening down the road. This is a much more strategic approach. It's not in any way set out to try and make one site look more viable than another. I think it's more to do with where things can be achieved, where things need to be done. And it's a holistic thing that will then set your SIL, and then we'll be saying, well, these are the pieces of infrastructure that are required across the plan, and in the first 5 years we'll look to fund it in these ways, and as we go forward we'll be funding it through SIL, New Homes Bonus, whatever it might be. So it's not not perhaps in the way you're thinking. It's not trying to make one site look prohibitively expensive or anything like that. It's more cumulative than that.
One final question then. Thank you, Andrew. So, for example, the secondary school and the primary school that have been apportioned to BAS 098 are actually schools that are needed for the existing housing that we have already to the west. It's just that we're going to put the new buildings on BAS 098 because that's the obvious place for them to go. Is that my correct understanding then, what you've just said?
The need created from the new and additional housing is where the generation of need comes for those school places. So it's not an existing need; it's a development need, if you like. And simply, the county have said to us where could it fit, and that's what they've said. Obviously, being a landowner there enables them also to have more control over that.
Councillor Lee.
if the county have provided this information, perhaps it would be useful if they got a grasp of what they do provide educationally, because there isn't a secondary school in Bramley, but they're planning on expanding it. So that, I think, could probably be taken out, because over the page you find there's money to spend. There is expansion of the local primary school, which is fine, but not the secondary. But I think, I mean, I go back to what I said right at the beginning of this evening. We are looking at a funding shortfall of £213 million, and that is without the items which are to be confirmed. And there are quite a few of those. So I'm afraid the Cabinet really does need to look at this and say, is any of this achievable? Because I can't see 213 million plus all the items to be confirmed being provided by anybody, by SIL or whatever. It's just pie in the sky, this. And then the other point I would like to make is that some 40% of these houses are being built in my ward, and there isn't a single item here of expenditure within or near my ward. The only item is the A339 Roman Road, Rooksdown Lane roundabout, which there isn't such a thing. There is the Roman Road roundabout, or there's Rooksdown Lane, and that's to be confirmed. So I got absolutely nothing, but we're providing 40% of the land for 40% of the houses. Thank you.
Yes, Mark.
Can I just provide a few comparisons with some other Hampshire authorities, because they've also got IDPs, and it's just to provide a little bit of reassurance in that we're not alone in having such a significant requirement. Fareham, for example, has 300 million, New Forest has 252 million, Portsmouth has 300 million, and these are some authorities that have still in place.
I don't disagree, but it's pie in the sky. This money is not going to be available.
Councillor Gardner.
Thank you. Page 208, last bullet point and the first bullet point on the following page, where we talk about the questionnaire that went out to the various organisations asking them about infrastructure and what they could provide and where else they thought it, where provision would be limited, where it could be possible. Did we take that into account when we were identifying Category 1 sites? That's the first question.
It was taken into account in the site assessment process. So when you had the coloured tables, that made reference to infrastructure availability and what's there and what's got scope to accommodate more growth.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. We've got that in at the right time. Page 211, 618, the last sentence. Given the economic context at the time of the preparing of the IDP, the amount of infrastructure identified will need to be funded as far as possible by developer contributions. As that comes under other funding sources, is that sentence actually in the right place? Because it looks more like a conclusion on the overall funding rather than a reference to other funding sources.
Officers will look at that. Thank you.
Okay, page 21, 11.5, should there also be reference there to the A34 as is referred to in 11.4 above? Well, this is on page 214. Yeah. No, in the first sentence where you're listing the various points. Page 22, 11.14, fifth bullet point. You talk about premium public transport network. What do you mean by premium?
So that's been taken from the Hampshire County Council Local Transport Plan. So I can get a definition from Hampshire to confirm that.
That would be useful. Page 23, there is discussion about the impact of the 339 heavy goods vehicle traffic due to the impact of the local communities along these routes. That also applies to the A33. because there are communities there which are impacted by traffic. And page 20, page 219, when we're talking about the public transport, we are still working on a hub and spoke transport system for public transport. Getting around the borough without actually coming into the town centre is virtually impossible. I think that ought to be something that's looked at some stage. And lastly, on the sheets you gave us tonight, on the second page, there is reference to it's halfway down where the red point starts, on the pink. A33 Bramley Road junction improvements. I think with development in Bramley, traffic will be going along the Bramley Road in both directions, and the A340 Bramley Road junction needs looking at as well.
Agreed.
Sorry? Yes.
The A340.
The A340 at the Queen's College Arms. Yep. That is certainly a bad junction at the moment, and it will get considerably worse with development in the Bramley area.
If I refer to the sheet, Bramley is misspelt about 4 times, which I think has already been mentioned once. I was very interested to see new 6-lane swimming pool strategically located, etc., etc., etc. Brilliant, because we have people from BasingstokeGov coming up to Tadley to use the Tadley swimming pool, so it would be nice to have some more. But actually, has anybody ever thought of, do you know, having some kind of diving facility? Because this has always been the criticism, we might have super swimming pool, but no diving facilities, and I think people have to go to Alton, if I remember rightly, if you're good at that sort of thing. Let me go back to the other. Roger's picked up 1 or 2 of my things. Could you explain, when it says on page 199 in 118, it refers to the Enterprise M3 LEP has successfully lobbied for pinch point funding on major bottlenecks, junction 6, etc. What's a pinch point funding? Well, yes, but it refers to it somewhere else. Sorry.
Pinch point funding is a funding mechanism that's given to LEPs to unblock motorway junctions. So our junction 6, the Blackdown Junction 6 work is called a pinch point funding, and that's what you bid through. But it's just, I think it's what it's saying at the moment. There's a pinch point there now, and it needs resolving, and so you get the funding through that.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit stupid.
Join the club.
No, sorry, there's 1 or 2 other things that I've turned corners over. I just wanted to say on page 222 in 1514, it just point out that Hampshire County Council, through work with its district and borough council partners on the Hampshire Senate and the Hampshire Alliance for Rural Affordable Housing, has begun work on Initiative Project 500, which aims to deliver affordable housing across the county on publicly owned land, which I thought was good news, as we've been talking about affordable housing and everything. So I thought I would just refer to that. Page 230, under acute care, general hospitals care and general hospitals, I thought it was a bit odd that there's 4 bullet points with Hampshire Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust including. Surely they shouldn't be as just 3 bullet points, they should be separate because they're all part of the same trust. Look, something else. Well, I've mentioned swimming pools, that's come up as another thing. And a rather rude comment when it refers to, on page 251, about 30.4, it talks about the Police Crime Commissioner's plan. I don't know what his plans are, but believe you me, if you write to him about a problem, you don't even get a response.
Councillor Mitchell.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm took a vow because of the time during all these meetings not to talk about the typos, and I promised to write in to officers with comments on that. But there's one particular typo. Well, it's not a typo. It's just I think helpful to the reader because it happens in the introduction to the plan as a whole, and that's page 197, shared vision, where people have said to me, what on earth does this mean? And it's to do with the use of the word where. We would be prosperous and thriving where, and people think, where will we be prosperous and thriving? Because it's a peculiar word. The problem is solved by putting a colon immediately after the word where in each case, because it clearly shows what you mean by the rest of that text. And the other thing, which is not, I'm not going to dilate on, but on the bottom of that page 1.12, the language and semantics of that paragraph are very, very difficult to get your head round, and I do recommend a bit of thought as to how to reword it or restructure it or something. Going on to actual comments on page 201, future housing growth. Well, we know that the Secretary of State has revoked the South East Plan Accept, so I suggest we take out all that thing about the Localism Act and all that sort of thing, totally redundant, and just say the Secretary of State has revoked the South East Plan with the exception of, so that we're very clear that we know that. I do think we should include, however, in here as a defensive measure, a statement to the effect that the South East Plan was based on long out-of-date evidence, and the Council is that therefore not considering the South East Plan number as a basis against which to review our housing. We more or less make that point, but I think we should make it as clearly as humanly possible, because the South East Plan, if it's cited by anybody, which it might be, still leads us sadly astray. Page 2. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't comment on anybody else's comments. I'm just making comments, if that's all right with everybody. Page 209. Again, this is just as... no, I'll send a note in. Don't bother to take up people's time there. Page 217. I'm not going into the detail of all the infrastructure costs and so forth, because others have covered that very well. 217... no, I'll write in about that. It's another structural thing. 225. Again, there's a note there which I'll write in about. I would like us, please, throughout all of this, to recognise that we are not alone on the planet. All of my children attended, no, 3 out of 4 of my children attended further and higher education organisations outside of the borough. Newbury College, and what my daughter loved me referring to as Quickly Laid College, because she claimed she hadn't been at the time, both of which are used by significant numbers of our residents, and are run outside the borough, in one case outside of Hampshire. And I do think we should continue to always recognise that, because we have an interest in them. Just a question for officers to pursue, but I'm not quite clear about 17.4. Mentions the 32 million. The original amount was dramatically cut, and we now know what's available. So if that was the original amount that still stayed in the document from somewhere, we need to only put in what's happened, because the money's been spent, and the rest of it ain't going to happen, or nobody thinks it's going to happen. Across the page, 226. I think when we talk about higher education, I'm doing things on the side about this, but we should also mention the fact that people in the town area have excellent rail services to central London, which has a plethora of first-class universities and colleges. Be nice if one of them established an outpost here, but that's another question. But they are highly available and accessible, depending on your ability to pay the train fare. But they're there. People do use them. Under secondary and primary education, again, we have a high dependency across quite a big chunk of the north of the borough on West Berkshire. And they have dependency on us. There's a huge amount of two-way cross-border shopping for children's education. Again, people come into the borough from across there and go out of the borough into West Berks for their secondary and primary education. And in some cases preschool. Page 229. Yes, I think this came up in debating committee earlier. I think here we should try to mention our view that where new school provision is being supplied, the propensity of parents to choose to send their children to those schools is a factor. And I think the idea that you might build a big estate and then expect people to go to an extended school 2.5 miles away when you should have had a school on the estate, etc. We really should emphasise that that we have a responsibility to parents regarding the provision of school places, and the county tends to look at it on a much too numeric basis. And this is our document. We shouldn't simply reflect the county view. We should put in what we think is the case. Across the page, preschool facilities may be required on site to serve strategic development. Well, if by strategic development we mean large sites, provision of money without the land or land without the money butters no halfpennies, and it won't work. You've got to have the land and the money. Now, the private sector might provide the money if it's got a suitable community facility to latch onto or something else. But land with, just providing the money, unless there's provision there where you could run a preschool, ain't going to help the parents on that estate. Under acute care, etc., we don't seem to see any mention of whatever that nice chap who came to talk to us called it, the clinical care something, the GP's club, which now decides everything, where the money goes, which hospitals you go to, all that common what it's called. We should bring this up to date, and it's out of the hands of, because they determine the future of hospitals now, by whether they send patients there and how much they're prepared to pay. And I can't see how the annual report and accounts, in any sense, constitutes a strategy. It may have some strategic intention written into it. Across page 232, under health centres and GPs, can we please slip in a reference to neighbourhood planning? In several areas of my ward, neighbourhood planning is embracing the building of new or changed or altered or extended surgeries, which are going to be in desperate need before long. And if we're going to put in these maps in the printed version, please can we be prepared to be wasteful and put in a map somebody can read? I mean, I know where these places are in my ward, but I had to work very hard to decipher whether that really was the name of it. And I'm looking, and also, Keith might explain here, I don't know, what does the line on this map mean? Because it goes in a peculiar way where it looks as if Whitchurch is somehow outside of something. It's a clinical care thinking. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And if we're going to refer, this is the clinical care gang. This shows how important they are. So we need to update that, please. Page 233. If the NHS are advising us that the proposed housing developments will require extensions to existing GPs I don't believe a word of it. If we have a strategic plan to put some 7,000 or 8,000 houses on Manydown, leading to 18 to 20,000 people, you cannot possibly say you're going to deal with that by extending some other surgery, which is tight for land anyway and too far from the place. You've got to put them, you've got to take into account the geography of the whole area. And that applies not just to Manydown, but to all of the other strategic sites. You've got to look at what the area looks like when that site has been built. And the fact that there isn't any money from somebody should not stop us from making the point that the need is to have a site that serves an epicenter of the population. Again, the map is unreadable, so please go and have a full-size map. Over the page 235, section 24.6. If the council really does have, I'm on the wrong committees obviously, because if the council really has a policy aspiration that everyone in the borough should live within 15-minute walk of community building, the council is utterly and completely mad. This is so unachievable as to be not true. It is so far from the reality as to be complete nonsense. And the idea that in Basingstoke town there's a significant number of properties out with the 15-minute walking time, try visiting a country village, goodness sake. Extraordinary. I walk 1.5 miles for a night out and that's certainly more than 15 minutes at my pace. Okay, yes, you could jog it. This may sound silly to you guys, but page 236 across the page, there's no mention of livery and riding, although riding is a major activity for a lot of people in the borough. They like to do it, and it's a sport or leisure activity. There's no mention of polo, and there's quite a lot of polo played in the borough, and even people who don't own polo ponies go and watch it. It's fun, and you might run into the Prince of Wales on a wet Sunday or one of his sons. And there's no mention of sailing now, and I'm less joking about that because all my children learnt dinghy sailing within about a half an hour drive of their home. And some of our borough has access to that particular facility. If it's the case, and I think it is, that most of our population don't have ready access to that, I would have it as a strong aspiration to provide it, and I might even be able to find the odd landowner who'd be prepared to provide some land to create a lake for dinghy sailing. It's one of the very most, it's English thing par excellence, and there's no reference to rowing. Where is the rowing? And that's more difficult to provide, I realise that, but no doubt that our former mayor will provide the canal eventually to row on. But on page 241, we do have this strange reference to water-based facilities, as opposed to swimming pools, and I was a bit baffled as to what a water-based facility might be. It wasn't something like dinghy sailing or rowing. I've no idea. What is it? Which requires storage, changing rooms, parking, and social facilities. It sounds like a sailing club, but there may not be one. I haven't come across it. Believe it or not, Newbury has the Newbury Sailing Club. There's nowhere to sail anywhere near Newbury, but they've got a sailing club, and they go on sailing expeditions. Madness. Page 248. Under libraries, we should make a note of the gradual removal of the library bus, which was a welcome resource by about 2 people in each village, and because nobody's using it, it's being removed. They're quite right to remove it, but we should note that, because it does leave quite a lot of elderly people out of reach of books, and it's only the elderly who still need books now, because everybody else is looking at peculiar screens. Page 249. No, I've avoided that. I was going to make the rude comments about the quality of drama at the Haymarket, which means we will gradually lose professional acting, professional theatre from the borough, because fewer and fewer people are going to it, and I'm going to fewer and fewer productions, and I'm a loyal supporter of the Haymarket. The quality of what's coming in on 4-night stands is increasingly depressing. Oh, well, I'm not alone. Page 254, and I might send a note if time permits. We really have got to mention the fact that the existing sewerage infrastructure, and I always get that phrase wrong, but whatever it's called, is totally and utterly shambolic. There are so many places in the borough that have sewage in the street, in the town as well as in rural areas, and sewage in the stream. And I'm not talking about pollution from the sewage works, I'm talking about stuff coming straight out of the drains, because, and I raise it there because this is where you quite rightly say that it's funded in 5-year planning periods, blah, blah, determined by the Office of Water Services. So the water utilities blame Ofwat for not allowing them to spend enough money. Have you ever heard anything so damn ridiculous from organisations that are making such stupendous profits? Officers are well aware of some of these problems, some of which are dire, and the effort needed to get their attention. And we should be very clear about that in here, as well as doing something about it, which we're trying to do. Page 258, I'm nearly finished, I think, because they're nearly at the end, not me. Page 258, BT Openreach and all that stuff. Sadly, and I may be out of date on this, or this may be out of date, but sadly, what we've got out of BT for the town has been brilliant for its time, but is hopelessly inadequate for the period of this plan, where the level of performance from broadband will be required to be up to 3 times as high as the wonderful facility that they've got now, which is up to about 16-20 meg. We will need 60 meg per home if we're going to be up to date and up to speed with the metropolises. We'll all have it, and that we should now go on from this aspiration for the town, and the aspiration for the rural countryside is inadequate. So again, I might try and write something in if time permits, but that is more or less saying we solved the problem, and we certainly haven't. We're a long way from solving the problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry to go on at such length.
Thank you very much. Councillor Peach?
Just some very brief comments. In this document here, it mentions the B3400 as it comes to mentions the costs or to be confirmed cost of that junction. And as before, I'd like to mention the point that as soon as you get past that junction, there is a single lane rail bridge. The other point to consider was mitigation techniques. I'm thinking of Brighton Hill Roundabout, where the community is explicitly said that they don't want certain types of mitigation, and yet potentially we might see ourselves doing the exact thing we know they don't want. Overall, I agree with John Leake 100%. When we look at the overall deficiency, it does beg us belief how we're going to make it all work, especially, and I think it emphasised the point even further, when our office is considered the rest of Hampshire that also has enormous deficits in their infrastructure. Picking up on the points around the surgery extensions, for example, in Winckelby, the very small surgery, which still hasn't reopened yet, is actually terraced in a parade of shops. So quite how you'd extend when it's got flats on top of it is beyond me. So if you are going to build a very large site of 3,000 plus homes on Manningdown, that exact point, we simply cannot rely on extensions of surgeries. And it's already oversubscribed as it is. There was mention on BAS 098 that we might have a school. I noticed in there that it was a suggested possibility, but considering on page 227 it suggests that, for example, Winckelby may have a deficiency by 2017, would suggest perhaps that might need to become a need. And very final quick point, just picking up from Councillor Mitchell when he mentioned about dinghy sailing. It's not an entirely random point, because we've got some of the best sea cadets in the country in Hampshire, and they're desperate to have facilities like that, so I would support that as well.
Thank you. I'll pick up on one point from Councillor Mitchell. It was to do with surgeries again, you mentioned. As another example, and I think it's very relevant because it involves Hampshire County Council. The surgery in Chinham is at capacity right now. Natural growth, it will exceed its capacity to an unsustainable level by the end of next year. It's expanded 3 times. There's nowhere else for it to go. Hampshire County Council own the land it's on, and there's a covenant that it can only be used for health care. So Razors Farm and all the north of and to the east of Chinham, it is the focal surgery. They're actually thinking of going into the Chinham Business Park, because they're so desperate. That's the only place they can think of going. There's no car parking. The car parking is ridiculous, but that's the crisis today. The only way they can think about it is we are actively trying to get that covenant removed, but it's the kind of blocks we get. We can't, no control in the borough because we're dependent on the county. And what they would like to do is lift the covenant, sell the land, and it's in a perfect place where you can put houses because it merges into an existing development. You know, that's the kind of logic we're trying to think here. And Chinham can accept that, but, you know, that's the way we're going. Right. Very briefly, mentioned about the A33 improvements and the A34. 4 years ago, Hampshire County Council came up with a county-wide route. They called it a major trunk route system. That's got nothing to do with cars. It's got everything to do with heavy goods vehicles. And the A33 and the A34 are major trunk routes north-south through the county. And this goes up into the motorway systems. Because there's lots of east-west, not a lot north-south. And that's the deficiency. So they've identified those, and we all know what the issues are with private motor vehicles, but that's the other component that overloads the roads. Page 230, one thing that's missing out of there, and I'm quite sure there are officers within the borough who know about it, there is going to be a new trauma hospital. Now there's 3 sites, I understand, being identified for it. The most likely site, and this is not on the record, it's just that there are 3 sites available, they're looking at Mitcheldever Station. And this trauma facility would include specialist post-cancer care as well, pre- and post-cancer care. It's a vital facility. It's being done on a regional basis because they're trying to space these particular hospitals around the county. And it looks like Basingstoke and Dean is going to get one here. I notice it's not on the list, but it's in very active consideration. It should be built by 2016 at the very latest. I've already mentioned the surgeries. I won't go on anymore, but those are the comments that I'm going to be putting in. You got some more?
You said, which marked something which I had forgotten. Under the duty to cooperate with neighbouring authorities, a lot of this provision, social provision, medical provision, etc., has to take into account, just as transport has, the fact that Newbury is planning to build umpteen houses, 1,000 houses, and so is Andover. And that has implications, because some of that will include some of these provisions. We need to know what they are saying about these and cross-reference it, because there's no mention to cross-border in this document, which I've tried to draw attention to a few things, but it's at the generic level, because the number of houses being built immediately on our borders is very high indeed.
Thank you for your contributions, members. I'm going to...
Sum up.
Okay.
We've just noted all the comments.
Oh,
what?
go on, because we're scrubbing the papers here.
Because this has only I've only been told this week, and it may have just happened. Apparently, I'm told, there's an EU regulation that's requiring Sainsbury and all the other people who have these big delivery trucks to cut their speeds down to 50 miles an hour. And Sainsbury are a very good outfit because they're loyally obeying that, and therefore the number of cars travelling behind in convoy the Sainsbury truck up the main routes has trebled. And I've actually noticed that for the last 10 days. The number of cars following Sainsbury trucks has trebled. I hope that can be brought to the attention of the transport people who are doing the transport assessment, because if they don't notice that, they'll have missed a big trick.
Right. We've come to the end, would you believe, of the document we started off with, planning infrastructure, the IDP and the various components of the draft local plan. It's recommended that that we note and make comment to Cabinet on the draft infrastructure delivery plan, which you've noted. The comments made by members have gone to officers who have noted those and will examine them against the draft plan. That's it. Thank you very much, members. It's been a long haul, but thank you for your perseverance. We reconvene on the 15th of July.